drone hobbyists. Oh. Getting I wonder if I hit the. Are we good now? Yep. Oh, it said IT wizards are unmuted. Can you hear me? Susan's not saying anything. Susan, can you hear anything? Susan for tester.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, now I can. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us know.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking, JR's sending me pictures of cookies. And so I thought I was like, well, they're eating lunch still. But thanks.
Okay. We're good to continue?
Yeah.
Okay. If it starts that you can't hear us, let us know.
Okay.
Okay. So we it came down to that we needed to pass a statute in order to make a rule for the agency. That we had a legislative concept in 2019. It was a bill that passed in 2021 that became a statute, and we'll show exactly what the statute says in the next a few slides from now. And then we began rulemaking process. The statute directs the agency to engage in rulemaking process that balances recreational use with resource protection. We started rulemaking process, and then that rulemaking paused in 2022. A work group was formed. You'll hear more about the work group. And then the work group met in 2023, concluded in 2024 with feedback, and we have a staff recommendation that you'll hear more about. So that's where we come today. Existing rules, we have drone use in our parks now. We've had it for a number of years. So we're managing drones currently with utilizing existing rules. So our park managers have the authority to close or restrict use of devices to protect park resources or safety, or to resolve user conflict. So there are places where we do not allow drones to take off and land temporarily for places. So at Smith Rock, when there are nesting eagles, we prohibit the takeoff and landing of drones there. For user conflicts around climbing, we will not allow drone takeoff and landing. At Vista House on the gorge, because it's a critical historic property and a high wind area, we typically prohibit takeoff and landing of drones there. At Silver Falls, in the area where the waterfalls, we've prohibited takeoff and landing of drones in that area. So there are specific places where we've prohibited takeoff and landing. Doug, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, and I apologize. You may get to this, but in a way, backing up to that DOJ assessment of the extent of our authorities, is there not a health and safety? Do we not have authority to regulate, say, drone activities where it has been launched off of state park lands, but where it has a demonstrable effect on health and safety of visitors or staff? Do we really have that sharp of a limit? For example, if somebody has a drone going through, like, say, where we were at Beverly Beach, through the campground area and 6 feet elevation, but it was launched technically outside of the park boundary, do we still have some authority in terms of health and safety that allows us to do something about that, even if it was launched by somebody who is technically standing outside of the park boundary? And I apologize, that's
Yeah.
sort of a weird technical question, but I think it could become relevant in a number of cases.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have the exact administrative rule that I referenced there, but there are two different administrative rules. One that looks at the protection of the general public when they're in parks, and the other would be the protection of the resource. So essentially, you're responsible for the behavior of your drone. If it's used in an unsafe manner, we have different administrative rules that would provide some protections in those circumstances.
Right, regardless of the point of operation or liftoff.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, cool.
The
Thank you.
challenge would be that we'd have to find the person who was
Precisely,
doing it.
yeah. I mean, that's an interesting challenge.
And if they weren't in the park, our ability to enforce an administrative rule from somebody who's not in a park property, it would be the difficulty.
Yeah, in that case, the enforcement would fall to the FAA.
But a ranger could intervene, even if it's an FAA enforcement issue, because it's directly affecting the immediate health and safety of, say, a park visitor. Sorry, I know that's a weird hypothetical, but
No,
I can see it
it's
happening where we have.
Probably accurate. The best way to
Yeah.
get to find out who's flying the drone is to knock the thing down and have them come get it in the park.
Precisely, or.
That's not legal advice.
Yeah. I mean, it's also plausible to have people who are operating just outside of the park boundary or outside of any place where we have jurisdiction who are visible and yet following their drone in a larger unit, essentially, that includes state park land, having adverse effect. So I'm just wondering where the extent of our authority is limited. Recognizing FAA has authority, but if our rangers detect an immediate threat to health and safety, do they have the ability to intervene regardless of the circumstances of the point of launch? Because they may not even be able to assess the point of launch immediately if they're following a drone to a campground area.
You know, I think as we heard this morning, that would be probably they would intervene in an educational manner rather than a regulatory manner.
Interesting. Yeah, all right.
Steve?
So, and thanks for doing this. It does kind of parallel some of the conversation we had this morning. And I think for me, the most important thing is to make sure we stay up on what others, FAA, I suppose in particular, is doing to regulate this. Just a quick horror story. All the fires we had in Harney County, there was news media people flying drones where the retardant planes were. And don't have any doubt somebody's going to fix that problem, which may in fact fix ours.
Yes, in the education and there are statutes against that currently, but education and behavior are definitely an issue. So these are the rules that we currently are enforcing. It is also important to note that we do have special use permits that sometimes areas that have been closed, we allow somebody to apply for a permit and then would allow them to operate a drone with a special use permit. The statute that was passed in 2021 has become ORS 837-350, and it requires the State Parks Commission to adopt rules managing the use of unmanned aircraft systems for people in state parks. And it's really important to note that it requires that we protect natural, cultural, scenic, and recreation resources. in parks and adjacent areas, but also provide for the enjoyment and recreational use of unmanned aircraft systems. So it's really around the providing the balance and working on the policy that will allow for people who are trying. We often get calls from people who are hobbyists or recreational pilots asking where can they fly and trying to do the right thing. So that as we're looking to craft this policy and the rules, we're looking to provide that clarity and guidance for people who are wanting to do the right thing. And then for visitors who want to know where they're not supposed to be. So it's trying to find that guidance. And trying to get to the balance of what is the acceptable use and what is the greatest resource protection that we can provide. So that is where you'll hear a lot about balance. And then I'm going to turn it over to Guy to talk about the work group.
Thank you, Katie. So in my previous role as a central resource manager, I was tasked with assembling a work group to essentially respond to the goal there that you'll see to create a clear framework that balances the diverse recreational interests of park users while preserving the integrity of the resources as well as the public safety. As we got this group started, there was a lot of work that needed to be done to talk about the mission of state parks and how our rules needed to reflect Oregon state parks. Because as you can imagine, a lot of different land managing agencies approach the use of drones a little bit differently, say as if the mission is more wildlife focused or recreational focused. So that was certainly a barrier just to kind of ground the conversation and set some context around finding that balance, which was what the original ask was of our agency. Because everyone was going to come at it from a different perspective. And really, we just looked at our agency's mission as kind of that guiding principle to make sure that there is recreational values associated to the work that we do, as long as responsibilities that relate to the resources under our protection. So the work group members, you'll see the full list here. I'll start with Emily Van Wink and Don Harris. Those were our two public agencies that served on the work group with the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Department and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then we had several recreational drone pilots on the recreational side that also offered their perspective about what it's like to actually trying to be, as Katie mentioned, a responsible user, what tools and resources and information that they need to essentially be a responsible user in state parks, as well as some special interest groups. You'll see Joe Libsite there with the Portland Audubon, and then also Philip Johnson with the Ocean Shores. And you certainly had all morning to understand a little bit more about how complex the ocean shore is as it relates to drones and wildlife. That continues on as well. We met in 3 different regions. So we held one group over on the eastern side at Smith Rock State Park, where we brought in some local interests. We had representation from the climbing community, as well as some outdoor enthusiasts that talked about birding in the high desert area. And at Silver Falls was the second meeting, where we had tribal membership participate in that process. And then the last meeting was at Nehalem Bay State Park, where it was a little bit more of the ocean shore focus, as you can imagine. When we first started this work, we really knew that we needed to break this into categories. We knew that there was going to be areas where we didn't want to see drones because of certain concerns. There was going to be areas that were most likely okay or safer to utilize drones for takeoff and landing. And then there was going to be everything in between. So the ways that we broke that down into categories was prohibited. And as we look at this is kind of through the lens of creating maps as the ultimate goal, so we could help illustrate where it's going to be appropriate to use drones for takeoff and landing. So red reflecting the prohibited areas, conditional, which would be okay some of the time, but maybe not okay in other portions of the year, whether that be high use or nesting seasons. And then green areas where, despite the time of year, there's really limited, potential negative impacts as it relates to the takeoff and landing of drones. So that's how we approach the categories. Now, the real work came into creating criteria for those 3 categories. So one of the handouts that I believe you were provided, color version that looks something like this, breaks down the criteria that was established and developed and revised over those 3 or 4 in-person work groups that we held across the state. we started looking at where do we just not feel drones are going to be appropriate. Now, I want to give the one caveat that, and you'll see in parentheses that exceptions can be made for a one-time exception through the special use process. So for commercial filming, we hear that come up quite a bit. That follows a separate review process, very circumstantial because it's a one-time thing that would be reviewed as appropriate through a different mechanism. But for the general use and general recreation, areas that could pose a negative impact to cultural resources is something that we felt strongly that we didn't want to take that risk or liability on. This is with the understanding that it's the takeoff and landing of that drone that would pose the cultural risk or risk to the cultural site. Or the retrieval of that drone if it were to fall. So it would have to be so sensitive that it would potentially be disrupted through foot traffic or an impact to a structure. Katie mentioned earlier the Vista House as being a good example. Overnight campgrounds, just because of the way that those facilities are reserved and rented, fall under a different classification there. So we wanted to remove that that conflict between uses. Areas sharing a boundary to federally or state protected areas that explicitly prohibit drone takeoff and landing. Most do not explicitly prohibit it. Some do. The offshore islands being a good example of Oregon locations that would explicitly prohibit takeoff and landing. So as good partners to our other public land managers, we wanted to make sure that we followed some sort of consistent practice there. Areas where drone use creates a hazard or pose risk to another use. Smith Rock is the easiest example that comes to mind. You can imagine climbing, a multi-pitched wall at Smith Rock, and all of a sudden a drone comes whizzing by, very distracting, I would imagine. Not that I would ever put myself in that circumstance, but if I was, I certainly would feel uncomfortable if a drone was zooming by my head. The next on that list is areas that contain a state or federally protected species that are negatively affected by drones. Based on current research, I believe Katie's going to be talking a little bit more about adaptive management. So knowing that research is going to change, we just wanted to make sure that the information that we were making determinations on kind of evolved with the way that we classified areas that was appropriate or not. The snowy plover areas would probably be the easiest example here on the ocean shore, where it's a federally protected species. They're here year round. We would close those areas. Areas that have no recreational access. This was more of an operational consideration. So not trying to promote a location that doesn't have a parking area, that doesn't have facilities, that doesn't have trails. It's still OPRD land. I'm thinking of the Willamette Greenway areas. We don't want to advertise a new use that might not be designed or conducive for a new recreational activity. So that was going to be marked as prohibited. And again, monitored through adaptive management. Areas under lease from OPRD. So this was one of the newest criteria that was added as we did some further evaluation. This really came up with ag leases. So a lot of land that we own, we lease out to other entities, but we haven't had conversations as to whether or not that's going to conflict with the way that they're utilizing that land. So once we do have those conversations, it would be factored in to either be green, acceptable, conditional, or remain closed as a prohibited site. So the next category is the conditional area. So this is any area that could be acceptable for drone use 1 day a year to 364 days a year, somewhere in between. A lot of what you would see here is seasonal use by wildlife, impacting potentially nesting seasons and things like that. But reading through the different criteria here, areas that contain environmental conditions that increase the risk of loss or control or recovery. If any of you have been through the gorge in the wintertime around Vista House, 100 mile-an-hour winds, not really easy to fly a drone in those conditions. So there would most likely need to be a seasonal closure in those situations. Some feedback that we got from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Department of Fish and Wildlife in Oregon was areas where wildlife concentrate for migration, breeding, nesting, or wintering. They have data layers to support this. So this was a pretty easy data set to incorporate into the mapping work that we would look to take on as it relates to, where are those critical habitats for nesting that we want to make sure are protected to not interfere with that wildlife behavior. Area sharing a boundary to federally or state protected sites. So a little bit different here. Columbia River Gorge being a really good example. Doesn't necessarily explicit takeoff and landing in a lot of those locations, but because they are also working through this challenge as well, we want to make sure that we are in line with their uses and can adjust either the amount of permits that we could potentially offer or the seasonality of that. Chair Hill, did you have a question?
Yeah, backing up on the guidance and Oregon conservation strategy, do we know how often that's updated and is it not periodic? I mean, I imagine these sites change frequently for breeding and nesting and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I have the formal answer to it. From what I understand, though, it's an adaptive management update where they're making updates periodically as they get more information.
Thanks.
Second to last is areas that contain critical habitat for state or federally protected species that are negatively affected by drones. So again, taking into account nesting seasons, marbled murrelet, for instance, is another topic that's becoming a lot more, or getting a lot more attention here in Oregon. And then sites at or exceeding capacity. So our high use areas where the use of a drone for takeoff and landing is just not going to be appropriate. We think, you know, Rooster Rock on busy weekends, Silver Falls, South Falls day use areas, those sites where there's just not the physical space to add in another recreational element. And then open is basically everything else. So any area that doesn't meet the criteria in the prohibited or conditional sites, with the caveat of there's also an exception just to promote a little bit more open-mindedness, where if there are certain concerns that relate to a conditional closure, if those concerns can be mitigated in any way, that we just wanted to keep an open invitation to have that dialogue for more space to be able to fly drones. So be glad to answer any questions on the criteria. It was certainly a lot of conversation and back and forth. I can tell you that the members of the work group were very passionate about this conversation, and you can imagine that they are at all points on the spectrum, with the exception of the middle. So it was interesting to see that despite the conflicting views based on, you know, a person's feeling about drones, at the end of the day, there was consensus on the criteria that was formalized at the end.
So I have 2 or 3 questions as I look at this. Are you aware whether FAA or others has worked through, in particular, the prohibited areas of flying, not takeoff and landing, but of flying, and does that overlap what we're doing?
They do. I don't know if Katie, you want to take that one?
So they have specific areas that are prohibited for flight, and in the second document you have, there's a best practices, and it does talk about some of the areas that are prohibited. And they prohibit in some special areas, and we would advocate and would encourage people to look specifically at where areas that are prohibited. And then they have areas, so like when you're talking about wildfires, those are temporary, I gotta use the right language because I'm not, temporary flight restrictions, such as wildfires. And so that's a responsibility of a drone operator to know where those are and to do that research before they fly.
So as a guy that has a drone in his trunk of his car and I pull into a state park, how am I gonna know this?
They have apps that show those. So we hear from many of the drone operators that they look at that.
Good.
And that there's dynamic mapping that they utilize. And then the FAA lists them on their website.
Thanks.
And an interesting point that somewhat piggybacks off your comment there is the technology in terms of responding to drones is evolving incredibly fast. So giving law enforcement the tools to essentially take over operation of a drone is something that is in the works for, as well as the identification of who that drone is registered to. So those things are, from my understanding, moving forward. When that becomes normal operation, I couldn't tell you, but the technology is there.
I think it's a really good thing. I believe I saw the director of the Department of Aviation was on your team. Right on.
And he is a commercial drone operator and longtime drone pilot, so has
Yeah.
a good resource.
Well, he would know the issues from both sides, so.
Commissioner Grassie's question is actually a very good segue into my slides, so thank you for that. We had that same question of how would the public and drone operators and even people who would maybe want to avoid drones want to find out that information? Would it be easily accessible? So the criteria was really there to help support a mapping system that could be easily accessed on our website, and ideally in the future be able to align with those apps that we had mentioned that have additional information with what the FAA provides, at least a one-stop shop that people can use. So with the work groups classification criteria, having these three prohibited, conditional, and open classifications, placing them as a map layer on our GIS available properties really help display where people could go, where they couldn't, and where those potentially seasonal or conditional areas are. We modeled these after our hunting maps, and then to show the different areas around the state, we picked 3 of them. We didn't name them because there was a lot of conversation about which properties to choose and particular affinities for folks wanting their favorite parks to be first. And that way they could look at exactly where and maybe get kind of into the minuteness about why or why not they should be allowed or not allowed. And that took the conversation away from all the work that went into developing the criteria. So we picked 3 of them across the state. We didn't name them, but some of you may be able to tell which ones they are. And this is one of the properties in the mountain region. And just because we have 3 criteria, it doesn't mean all 3 are going to be displayed at every park. In fact, it could be that some parks are completely prohibited overall, and we wouldn't even be providing a map at that point. Or if they have areas that are open and prohibited, or they have conditional areas, then we can show those changes. So there was another question earlier from Commissioner Duerr about what about other visitors? What about campers? What about safety? And with that in mind, the prohibited criteria also calls out no takeoff or landing over overnight campgrounds. You can see in the zoomed in photo here that there are campground loops where it would not be appropriate for drone users to be taking off and landing. Along with that, you can see that there's close proximity to neighboring properties, neighbors. We have a river, we have roads. So there are a lot of things to consider here. And we try to capture a lot of those concerns throughout the classification criteria modeling.
So that open area that's got loops in it, is that a campground loop?
In the green or in the red?
Yeah, the green, I'm sorry.
The green is a day use loop.
Okay,
Yep.
and so therefore permitted.
Do you know which one it is? Which property it is?
I'm guessing in my brain.
Okay. We'll play the quiz later.
Day use.
So our second map is showing along the coast here. So even though a lot of people associate the coast with very abundant open spaces, you can see that this particular property stretches quite a ways and is mostly prohibited. And that also goes along with trying to align with the federally protected areas where there wouldn't even be allowed flight under the FAA restrictions, so that we don't also conflict with them and allow takeoff and landing. So those areas are all prohibited. There are other unique things about this property, such as an airstrip where similar to when wildfires are happening, we don't want drones to be flying around. It does interfere with the flight, takeoff and landing of aircrafts, not just drones. So we have some conditional areas and some open areas, and while limited, it really comes down to that word balance that we're trying to find, giving people an opportunity to recreate. People want to do the right thing for the most part, and they do come to us asking, where can I go to do this safely? Where can I go where it is allowed? So making sure that there are safe, available options was really critical. It would be very easy to shut down the whole thing and say, like, it's just a plain no all the way around. So looking for that balance was tricky, but really important to make sure that we honor all the different types of recreation.
So in that, like that Northern Mystery Park. I would assume you'd have marbled murrelet, you'd have inaccessibility, like if a drone goes down lacking trails. Some active use areas. I'm sorry, what? Elk on the runway. So I assume those would be big ones on those. What would be other going back to the criteria, what
Yep.
would be also disqualifying about that area, just so I'm cultural resources?
Yeah, cultural resources would be a really big one,
Yeah.
aside from just like visitor safety. A
Yeah.
lot of those areas are very difficult to access
Right.
as well, so.
Yeah. So it's like just a combination of those.
Yep.
Essentially creating, and did you create independent, sorry, that's a nerdy question. I do this. Did you create independent overlays for each one of the criteria and then just sort of drop those one on top of the other and see where it all adds up?
I do not know. I am
Yeah,
not
that's okay.
the brains behind the
Yes.
GIS layers.
Says yes. Okay, good. Yeah, cool. All right, excellent.
We do not want to share the independent layers because there are concerns about like,
Understood. yeah.
identifying
For
cultural
example, cultural
things.
resources would be like
Yeah.
a bullseye on the map. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great.
So that's
thank
why you see just a giant red spot instead of a specific.
you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. Thank you.
So as we're doing this, I'm looking for the apps and it's pretty interesting how thorough those apps are. And honestly, I've never looked for them before. Matter of fact, FAA only recommends 4 apps that are out there. So really cool stuff that's there. And the only thing I advocate for is that we don't ever end up with conflict. And that sounds like what you guys are looking for. So.
We would also prefer to avoid the conflicts. And as we get in here, you can see that that's going to be tricky because here in the Valleys region example, we have quite a lot of variation in terms of the classification that are displayed. I would like to draw attention particularly to the little island green open area towards the left, bottom left on that zoomed in portion. Just remember that little area exists. We'll come back to what an island means and what that looks like later. But it does get to the point of how nuanced are these borders, and how much can we zoom in and out so that people can really know and understand where they are allowed and where they are not allowed to take off and land, and what are those differences. So this is a really great example that shows kind of the variation and the minute amount of details it could get into. So these maps are really interesting and people like seeing them. Why didn't we provide more maps in preparation for the feedback? We got that question quite a bit. The maps are visually the easiest way to communicate what it is that we're trying to do. But logistically, it was hard to create maps for every single one of the 250 plus properties that we have to show all of the criteria in place, especially with the likelihood that the criteria could change. It being just the draft form out of the work group recommendation and it not being into rule yet, it would have just created a lot more work for our staff to be able to create these property maps, and then to go back and have to start over if things change drastically. So we really tried to pick a good variety from across the state and show the best that we could the implementation of the classification criteria, because that's really what we wanted feedback from the public, from what we wanted people to see how it could be applied. And it really, if we had done it for each of the park properties, the feedback would have been it would have been detailed to each of those properties. I live close to X Park and it looks like you're allowing drone takeoff and landing very close to my house, and said concerns rather than getting the overall feedback on the classifications themselves. So because of that, we try to keep it a little bit more mysterious. We applied it to just the 3 so that people could get an idea of it without getting too into the weeds. And we also were looking at this in terms of how would these maps stay adaptable. We talked about adaptive management, and that there could be changes that come with that as well. So there were a lot of things to consider here. We didn't go with all of the maps. It was a point of contention, but we hope that the sampling that we did gave enough of an idea of what we wanted to achieve. And because adaptive management is going to inform what these maps say and how we apply these classification criteria, it is going to be critical that we have like an open feedback process. This isn't a new strategy, but adaptive management has become more of a popular approach to natural resource management. And for our sake, it really means that we are going to be looking at the data as it changes, as we get more information, as potentially the protection of species changes, or we see introductions of new activities and new recreation activities in some areas, or discoveries of other culturally significant resources. We have to be flexible. We have to be ready to change, and we want to make sure that the public is with us, that they also understand that there's a level of flexibility. These are not static maps, and that they are also responsible for being able to keep up and look at the research before they engage in their form of recreation. And then accompanying the classification criteria table in front of you is the recreational drone best practices. This was also put forth with the work group, and has a lot of good tips about where they can fly. Makes a lot of references back to the FAA. We really want to be clear for enforcement for our rangers and for our visitors to understand that we do not get to enforce what the drones are doing in the air, and that is hard. But it is important that that's something that we can communicate and go back to. And then just being able to reiterate that there is a level of responsibility on the users themselves. They need to know where they can go. They need to be able to follow the guidelines, and that we have a responsibility to protect the wildlife and the environment, but also so do they. Then all of this information was put forth to the public. We had some open houses. We talked about this feedback. We displayed the 3 example maps, the classification criteria, and the best practices sheet. And we had the feedback period open for about 3 months. Just last year, we received over 300 pieces of feedback. And saying feedback in place of comments is intentional, because this isn't part of public comments in our rulemaking. It's less formal, but it was a challenge to get people to understand those differences. And really, we wanted people to take a look at the materials and the outputs developed by the work group to see if it seemed like a fair way to balance the recreational need and then the resource protection need, and get their take on that. But the feedback that we received really, for the most part, had a lot more personal. Did I go back too far? Had a lot more personal opinions about drone use rather than the classification criteria themselves, whether or not people were in favor of or were opposed to drone use. So it did get confusing, and there were some other challenges as well. But what it really came down to was understanding the public's perception of drone use and the way to balance it. So it was really important that we were able to identify the trends in some of the comments that we got back. So for the most part, people are concerned about the noise, the safety, the enforcement, resources, the potential over-regulation, why some people can do certain kinds of recreational activities and other people can't, the permitting, what that would look like. And then there was also some form letters that were a lot more abundant than other pieces of feedback that we received. So for staff, ourselves, like the public feedback challenges were really focused on the articulation of what conditional meant, confusing the maps and the criteria with rules themselves. And so that when we do delve into rulemaking, once again, it is going to be challenging to sort of identify, this is what the rule language says. These are products developed because of the rule language, and showing those differences. But really, ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to make it easy to understand where you can go, where you can't go, and why, and what happens if you do. So we tried to make that simple as we could, but it's still going to continue to be a challenge. People are going to have their opinions, and we're looking forward to rulemaking. Well, with that, I'll give it back to you guys so you can let you know about the recommendations that came out of, all of our findings.
All right, thank you. So staff recommendation goal, land managing agencies have approached this in a variety of ways. You'll probably hear more that have just had an all-out ban, whether that be state parks or national parks, but the task that we were given was somewhat different, and that's twofold. One was to adopt rules, and the second was to protect the resources while providing an opportunity for recreational use of drones. So that was our goal. And then that's where the criteria stemmed from, as well as the future steps related to mapping, which we'll get into here in a second. As far as the specific staff recommendations, it would be to move forward with administrative rulemaking, as Joe mentioned, with a few slight changes to change the criteria from conditional to seasonal. Just what does conditional really mean? Seasonal is really what we're after. It's going to be appropriate at certain portions of the year or certain times of the year, and not appropriate at other times of the year. As Joe pointed out, we want to review the criteria around the overall size of the islands, which is just a matter of scale. If you zoom into a property, it might appear large. If you zoom out, it's going to appear small. So how people interact with the mapping software, something that we just don't know that answer yet. So having that conversation and figuring out, what is the smallest of an area that seems to make sense, just to help yourself orient in a park property, so you know that you're in the right place. And then last, number 3 there is consider adding language to adjust for park manager and resource staff discretion to completely prohibit drone takeoff and landing at specific parks if most of the park property will be classified as prohibited. And really that's just, there's going to be areas where it's a better opportunity for them to get out and fly. If we're just isolating to a small location, there might be better parks where this recreational activity is going to be more appropriate. And then Katie, do you want to take on B, or want me to just work through that? Okay. And then the second part of this is looking at the implementation strategies and tools. So as Joe shared with you, there's the best practices, how we get that information out to the people that are going to be utilizing drones, whether that be, signing up for a free permit before you fly, but, kind of forces you, like when you make a reservation, to review that information beforehand. Make sure that we formalize our adaptive management strategy. So as conditions change in a park, a major wildfire comes through, the environment changes, the wildlife habits are going to change. How is our drone management practice going to change along with it? A clear permitting process, and that's probably the largest area of work to do. We need to develop a permitting system that would not only help relate to the mapping work that is relatively straightforward to produce. Sorry, GIS folks that have to do all that work, but really can help us reflect the seasonality, whether it's okay. And we're going to offer 5 permits on a day because that's how big the park is, and we feel like that's the number that's appropriate. Whether that number is going to be 25 a day, and whether that's going to change throughout the week, throughout the year. And then lastly, clarify rule enforcement and training for internal staff and communication for external audiences. We reference some of the other administrative rules that we already have to work with, relating to the impacts of drone use. So are our rangers prepared to utilize this new system, as well as, when these rules might be the tools that they use to get compliance versus the other administrative rules that Katie kind of shared at the beginning.
So we're about wrapping up. You've heard many of these challenges already referenced, but we just wanted to highlight some of the challenges that are still out there. As Guy just mentioned, many of the implementation challenges are still there, permitting, developing the adaptive management strategy. Many of the comments and concerns that have been referenced are around unique ocean shores concerns, whether it's resource protection or the unique relationships with federal land managers within the ocean shore, the size of the zones or the islands that Joe mentioned. And then the bottom line is there's not an agreement about whether recreational use of drones is an appropriate recreational pursuit within state parks. So whatever we do within rules, we are not going to get consensus on that bottom line. So when we go to do rulemaking, you all are going to have to be comfortable with that within the comments. And so we have a statutory requirement to do rulemaking to provide a balance. you're gonna get comments from people who don't believe that drones have a recreational role within state parks, and that's not gonna change. So wanting, Betty.
Yeah, just a question just around public perception or like whether or not, how they feel about drones. Do you have data about how people generally feel, not people who use drones, but people who don't use drones, how they feel about drones? I'm wondering like what proportion of the population, just probably you don't have this data for Oregon, but maybe nationally there's some survey data that's been done. But what proportion of the population actually utilizes drones, and how do the rest of how do others feel about drones?
We can definitely look into specific data. I know from our comments we have data, but specific like actual data, I don't know that we have gathered that. So I think those are great questions.
And just one comment on that is when we looked at the trend of recreational drone use, it's been exponential over the last few years. So that's going to be the other factor that we have to consider when we look at our rulemaking is, it was a relatively small niche group that was utilizing this when it first came out. But drone sales and use has grown over the past 5 years substantially.
So then we're just on to the next steps there, and we split this out into two sides, both the rulemaking and then the management. From a rulemaking side, in order to move forward, we would convene a new rule advisory committee with folks from all sides. It would be separate from the work group. The work group was a recommendation to the director. This would be a brand new rule advisory committee to help draft rules that would implement the criteria that was recommended. We would do public comment on the draft rules, and then it would come to the commission for consideration of adoption. On the management side, we would finalize the best practices that you see here, develop maps that are based on the criteria, develop a permitting system, adaptive management strategy, and then train staff on enforcement and education resources, and develop a public education campaign to implement the rules. And all of that would move on a coordinated but separate tracks, because they would need to move simultaneously in some areas, and then one would move forward and then the other would follow. So we need to do both in order to make this work. Steve.
So I'm backing up a little bit, but how big a problem is this? Are we seeing a lot of drone usage in the parks?
Yes, we see it. Some parks, it's happening and it's not a problem in some places. In some places, it's a problem and our staff are dealing with it. We are managing drone use currently. So in some places, it is more of a problem. The biggest reason to have rules is to provide clarity and make it easier for people to understand where they can and can't utilize.
So it makes sense, but then what about the really big areas that parks has some authority over? Scenic rivers, the beaches. I mean, those places are huge. How do you see that playing in these rules?
So the ocean shore, we would write rules for. Scenic waterways, we wouldn't have any rulemaking authority there. But the ocean shore, that is really where the crux of some of the concern is. So parks, I think it's a little bit easier because pretty much everybody agrees we're not going to have them in campgrounds. And then it's kind of easier to articulate where they can and can't go within a park in a day use area. But the ocean shore is one of the more challenging places to identify.
Katie, was there a discussion about requiring everybody to get a permit in order to, and how did that go? What were some of the discussions for not doing that even in the green zones?
It's one of the things, and it's a discussion and it's not I don't think it's off the table. That was one of the things that Guy had referenced. Do we require a no-cost permit that then you're checking that you've read the best practices?
Yeah.
The
And that's-
concern
yeah.
is the logistics of that and our technological capabilities,
Yeah.
but that is an option.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I see this and it's just like, this is where you can take off and land. I mean, that's not really what we're trying to convey. We're trying to convey a map where it's best to operate your drone in that area. And so ensuring that somebody has read those rules, looked at the map
Mhm.
before going out and operating. And I know permits are such a pain in the ass, and this whole thing sucks in the sense of like having to spend so much time doing GIS and draw maps for every single thing, but it's also, it lends to better practices, I would think, on the ground.
Yeah.
How other people feel.
Yeah, I have similar responses. Just wondering about the permitting system. If they are so high-tech that they can figure out how to use a drone, they should be high-tech enough to say, use their phone to tap into our permitting system. And confirm that they have acknowledged that they've seen the maps and that they understand best practices, and that then they have maybe a code that they have if a ranger asks them. It seems entirely plausible to, again, ensure that they've been exposed to that material prior to operating a drone. And I know there are a number of other systems coming online on public lands and even on private lands where there are these basic kind of checkbox confirm that you've acknowledged best practices before you get your free permit. So those are very reasonable responses to this. And I guess, so that was on my mind. And then the question of how this all intersects with the yellow or orange areas on the map, which I find very interesting because you say those can go from being open 1 day a year to 364 days a year, which means basically red to basically green and everywhere in between. And I wonder if you can comment, just, I kind of anticipate what the responses will be, but just how that will be a fairly contentious process possibly to designate what yellow, orange means. And do you have a sort of a process already in mind? I mean, I know some of these are obvious. They're like nesting periods, and we have the, ODF and W and others that give us guidelines for that. But I imagine there are other constraints on the seasonality of the use of those areas. So I was wondering if you could just speak to that. And I'm thinking about that also simultaneously with this permit concept in my mind as well. Like, do we have to, especially in those yellow areas, orange areas, especially make sure that people are aware of those restrictions, the timing, locations, and boundaries. So anyway, that's a little roundabout, but I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak to, like, how are we going to establish those seasonal parameters in the yellow, orange areas?
So I'll try to answer that question as easily as I can. So the default is nesting season.
The default is nesting
That's
season.
the default.
Right.
We are looking at other considerations like a high use circumstance or something like that,
Right.
where you might change not necessarily where you can take off and land, but you might change the inventory of how many permits you authorize.
Right.
So that would be the other factor, is if we're starting to see, dozens of drone operators show up on any given day, and that exceeds like a carrying capacity, too many drones in a small area, we could limit or reduce the amount of permits that we authorize in that location. It wouldn't necessarily change the color on the map,
Right.
but we would have some sort of control as to whether or not they were able to, obtain a permit for that day.
Right.
But I would say the general consensus was that we would start with nesting season, evaluate it
As the
through
baseline.
adaptive management, with the slight exception of sites at or exceeding capacity would most likely fall under a different classification, and that would be conversations
Right.
through or with park managers looking at our day use overnight statistics of how many people are using the parks.
Okay. Yeah, because it seems like I like the criteria, obviously, the red, yellow, green. And that by articulating those, you lock down a lot of things. It makes it fairly straightforward for some of the mapping and the regulation that follows. But I could see the negotiation of that yellow zone becoming almost as complex as establishing the original criteria. There's sort of criteria within criteria for that category. And so it'll be interesting to see how that piece of it evolves.
Yeah, we wanted to keep the ability to manage that behind the scenes. So
Understood.
we
Yeah.
could change that frequency of when a permit was even available.
Right.
without going through rulemaking. So
Right.
it'll allow us to have the flexibility if we're starting to see concerns. Like for instance, wow, the weather's going to be 90 degrees this weekend. Silver Falls Day use
Well,
area is going to be
exactly.
slammed.
And
We're going to remove all the permits that day.
I was pleased to see that discretionary authority that's provided to park managers as well, being built into the logic of the rulemaking, and maybe that's how it fits in. And again, speaks to the value of what Commissioner Hill was just speaking about in terms of a permit system, because you don't often know in those kinds of cases very far in advance whether those areas are open or closed, which is another reason to check back into the system to kind of verify. So I know you guys have thought about all this. I just kind of want to,
Yeah, I will say
Hear what
that
you're thinking.
everyone on the work group agreed with getting a permit regardless of where you're flying in a state
Okay.
park. So even the drone pilots wanted to see the best practice information reviewed, because again, these are responsible people that
Right.
want to know where to go.
yeah,
So I think that was there was general consensus over that. It's probably something that would come back up and need to get addressed during the
Right.
rulemaking process.
right, yeah. Okay,
And
great.
some of this is of course hypothetical until we can develop the
Until,
permitting
yeah,
system.
yeah. Okay, thanks. Good answers. Appreciate it.
So I really like the permit idea. And I guess I got a question for us. Chair Hill, you said it, and it's the point. The guy that flies his drone over my hot tub, I don't care where he took off from. And
Just play
it's
a-
as simple for us as having a place to take off and land. And all the rest of this is stuff we don't have any authority over. I think, I don't feel any differently about this than I do about e-bikes. They're motorcycles. I don't care what anybody says. And I have one, and I have a drone. And I can tell you, I've never looked to where I can and can't fly. And I would bet you that I bet more people do that than not. But I think we need to be pushing with our partners. You guys need to finish this up. This isn't our job. Once they're in there, it is not our job. And somebody else needs to be picking that up, and we ought to be pushing that fact.
Don't most drones not operate in FAA regulated space, like where, I mean, when I lived in DC, you couldn't even take a drone off because it was surrounded by naval bases and whatnot. So I assume that, I mean, at the federal level, there's some restrictions around that in newer drones. I don't, maybe it appears as 10 years old, I don't know, but.
And other than around PDX and this Salem Airport and a few others, there's not a lot of restricted areas on that. Drilling down further, you may find more, but that's their job. And again, I just think we ought to be saying, do this. We can. We have no authority to do it, much as I'd like to.
Eventually run the hot tub.
Yes.
Talk to the FAA about it.
Here's our maps. Enjoy.
I just two things. One is a comment. I really appreciate the discussion around limiting permits based on really specific criteria like nesting season or like removing all permits for a specific day. I think it might be challenging to limit the number of permits versus like, you know, if it's going to be a really busy day, there's no permits allowed versus like, we'll give 5 permits, for example. Like that to me just feels like it could be really difficult to enforce. You see 5 drones out there, you're not sure if they have a permit or not because you limited the number of permits that day, but you didn't withdraw all of them. And the other question I have is around enforcement. So if somebody breaks the rule, would the approach be like, you know, walking your dog off leash or whatever, where a park ranger or beach ranger goes out and, you know, asks them to take down their drone, and then if they don't, then they get a fine? Is that the enforcement approach? And if it's a fine, is it also I don't know what it was called, like a class A $440? I know, because I'm gonna be a park ranger one day. Is that the same approach that would be taken?
Yes. So it would be one of our existing administrative rules. So it would fall within the same enforcement philosophy. So we try to start with education and, we would continue to do that, but it would be a, class A, most likely because it's resource damage often, it would be class A violation and, so that, and that's the extent of our authority. So we don't have the ability to have it be a higher, there've been a lot of requests for us to have a higher fee, but that's not within our authority to do.
And just to provide a little bit of reassurance there, what rangers are going to be evaluating when they make contact with an individual is going to be, what's the impact here? If there isn't any impact to the natural resources or isn't a disruption to like public safety or something like that, it's going to lean towards the educational side.
Right.
If somebody's intentionally trying to get a close up of a peregrine falcon nest, I mean, it's going to be a different response in that
Right.
circumstance. So
And to Commissioner Grasty's point, people buy these, right? And they don't know there's rules. It's like, well, I was able to buy it at Costco and just take it out and fly it, right? So we always try to start with educational unless it's really egregious.
So that was the extent of what we wanted to talk about today, but we appreciate all of your questions and we'll probably be back to talk about it in the future. So
Thank you
you.
guys for all your
Thank
hard
you.
work.
Yeah,
I know
thank you
this
very
is
much.
Yeah.
One of the hardest issues.
And for those of you that are newer, this is what, 8, 9 years now in the making, and we literally paused and said, we just need to talk about this in a different setting, because there are a lot of beliefs about should you, shouldn't you, and it's like, that's not what we were asked to do, like, you gotta take the emotion and the property out, and it's been a lot. They've
Told you.
done a great job.
Just like at the beach. Exactly. I came over and sat down after lunch. I'm like, oh my God, I'm still at the beach. Really not getting wet. Summer down in Utah. Yeah. Down at Zion and Bryce County. Oh my, I never saw a single drone in a single day.
Yeah.
Where?
When I went down to Utah to Bryce Canyon. The national. And what we do.
Because our statute says we have to allow for the enforcement.
We have to allow what?
So when you look at the statute, it says protect resources while providing for the enjoyment of recreational use of UAS. So because they put that in there, we have.
What's that in?
We have to allow for it as opposed to just what the original. Follow with the.
Oh.
So.
I just don't think they're in place. Fly drones. Cut down a lot of this meeting time and they're prohibited in the store. Done. Percent of the population is flying drones. 0.0001.
Shows that you are very passionate.
I've got a well. Did Steve talk to you? I got it. Feels like we're still at the beach. Just not, just no rain. I'm sure it does.
Long time ago.
Well, it's got a couple.
I want to see it overseas. I know that thing would be down like that.
I'm checking in one day too. And pneumonia. I'll shoot you. What's that? Honestly. It's still that. I was thinking about. Perfect, yes, so, So I would ask you a question as well.
These are really.
Yeah, it's 2.5 hours.
By saying that we have to also provide the environment.
All right. Yes. When you're using this. User pointer here. What's up? Sorry. The big conversation. Okay, you can also move the slides, so if the slide goes blank, it's probably because you're talking on the rest of the finger.
Serious with FAA or anybody else is thinking about.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
And so go ahead and wrap it and get filmed on the wrap it, which is really nice until it's all done.
I don't know. Yeah.
My son does video.
I'm hoping. For this, but yeah, because if not, I'm gonna run out. I don't have to. I'll sit here.
Person, otherwise it's like, there's that trend, remember, in the news where everybody was just like, everything. I don't wanna watch your kid. I don't wanna see it, yeah. Great. Long day, all right. We ready? Let's keep rolling on through here. So next up, we've got the Ocean Shore State Recreation Area discussion.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Hill, Commissioners, Director Sumption. Again, for the record, Kevin Herkamp, on the Ocean Shore Coordinator. We got to know each other very well this morning. With me today is Tyler Blanchett, our Permit Coordinator. And so we're gonna tag team this. So we've got 3 sessions this afternoon. They're really kind of one session broken into 3 parts. We're going to start off with really talking more about the policy, kind of what the statute actually says. We did talk a little bit about that out in the field this morning, but we'll go into more kind of what the words are. And then the second session, and that'll help kind of build a foundation of what the beach bill says. And then the second session, Tyler's going to talk about some of the realities of what we're seeing out on the ocean shore with some of these projects as they're being built. And then the third session, I'll kind of try to tie everything we looked at this morning and through the presentations back up with more of a, here's what we've seen, what's happened over the past, where we're at today, and kind of what we need to start thinking about moving into the future. As I said, this is really more of an educational workshop from the standpoint of we're going to be looking at pursuing rulemaking, other things over the next year or so, and really starting to have some of these conversations. And so this is just trying to bring everybody up to speed, and I'm sure we'll be having more of these conversations. So with that, right, operator error. So this first workshop, we're looking at the beach bill, the policies that are in the beach bill. And we'll be looking specifically at the ORS, and I apologize, it is a little bit text heavy. I've tried to boil it down though. There is actually quite a bit more of the statute out there, but I don't really want to put everybody to sleep after that great lunch. And this will set us up for a little bit of a foundation for this afternoon's workshops 2 and 3. So kind of a little context on how the beach bill applies. So in some of the dialogue that we have later this afternoon, what it really applies on the coast. So we've all talked about there's 362 miles of our coastline. That's one way of measuring it. You can come up with different numbers depending on how you measure, but 362 is pretty much what we all say is the coastline is. But out of that, the important thing is to understand that about 2/3 of it roughly is kind of what we'd call usable beach. It's beach area. And about half of that, or just under half of that, is privately owned. And so majority of Oregon's beaches are publicly owned, which is a great thing. And that's split, as you see here, between state, federal, and local ownership. Really where we're going to be focusing in on this, a lot of our dialogue is this 120 miles roughly that are privately owned, because that's where we're getting the requests. And as we talked about on the tour, a little bit of this portion here that is in ODOT ownership, because there is now the ability for them to get the exceptions to the Goal 18, to Goal 18 in order to actually pursue shoreline protection. A lot of these the presentations today are going to talk more about shoreline protection, because that is really kind of the impetus behind a lot of the rules. It's where we're seeing a lot of the pressure on the program, and that we're going to use that kind of as a capstone to the bigger issues. And rulemaking will be addressing other things as well, but this helps kind of set that broader context.
Kevin, can we ask as you go along, the question, help me understand that 119 miles. Does that mean that somebody has a deed that shows they own out to the middle of the ocean somewhere, or what's that mean?
So I'm going to speak in extreme generalities because it is different everywhere. And there's a lot of history on, I mean, even some of the public land was sold at one point at kind of the, before 19, I think it was 24. There was some land sales of public lands. There's a lot of different things, but generally speaking, the upland owner will own out to the ordinary high tide line. And that's where the state has then said, we, as a state of Oregon, owns below the high tide line. And so it also be referred to as the meander line. That's what a lot of the deeds have on them. There's, like I said, that does change. Some stuff that may have been developed more recently may have different meets and bounds on it, but generally speaking, their private land will go out to the high tide line.
And is that ordinary high tide line an established line, or is that one of those you described this morning as moving?
It would be more of like a meander, the meander line. It moves. And one of the documents I've read, I think, showed that in some areas of the coast, that high tide line can move by, I think it's 80 feet or more in a given year. So again, it's one of those where it's based on, as we talked about on the field, the sand levels move and change during the year. So it's, I forget that, I think it's is it a 10 or a 20 year? There's kind of a time period that's used of saying, where does it get to at that average over that time period? And again, that's where surveys and other things would have to come in to help establish that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so the beach bill itself, there's a lot more to it than what I'm going to share with you today. But really what I want to do is take a few of these quotes out of it and show kind of the intent behind it, and how, when we're presenting the rulemaking, what we'll be going back and looking at and working with our council to develop the rules to help support these. So as what came out of it, as you see on the screen here, was really the main emphasis was we're bringing the beach into the public's and recognizing the public's rights here, and really preserving those rights in perpetuity. That was the intent. And so when you see this first bullet here, it's having that free and uninterrupted use by the public of the ocean shore, right? And the second part is really codifying that the public has had this right, and that it's the state's job to protect that right, and do that through, as in the point 3 there, is that we're going to manage it as a state recreation area. And so really being able to take that and protect it under that banner. And this fourth bullet's one of them I've kind of, I keep going back to, is it's a pretty broad directive of that it's really up to us to be doing whatever we can to protect and preserve the recreational use of the ocean shore. And it's that whole term of whatever is necessary. And that's going to be, I think, a lot of the dialogue as we go through rulemaking is, what is that term? How far does that go? And as you heard earlier, it's that balance, right? It's the balance between protecting that and also recognizing that there are private property ownership onto the ocean shore. So within 390-615, Commissioner Grassley, this goes back to your kind of question, is in 360-615, basically the state affirmed that out to the extreme low tide line, up to the ordinary high tide line is the state ownership on the beaches. As I think most of you might be aware, the state also owns out to the 3 mile, 3 mile line. That's managed by the Department of State Lands. So basically, once you get out past this point, it's Department of State Lands. OPRD manages from that extreme low tide up to the top of the ocean shore, on the easterly edge of the ocean shore. But there is an affirmation of that ownership, and then there's an affirmation of the public right on there. So how did that come about? Well, in 1967 was the first iteration of the current beach bill. Out of that, they established kind of a 16-foot elevation, a few other things that were difficult for the public to understand. So out of that legislative action, ODOT then went actually in and surveyed and took specific points, as you see down here, to define where the existing vegetation line was at that date and codify that as a statutory vegetation line. Each of these survey points is actually codified in our statute. And it created an actual line out there that surveyors could go out and say, this is where that line is at, and it gave that regulatory certainty. And that was codified in the 1969 version of the bill. So going back to our management, and you'll see that it actually reiterates a few of the points from before, but one of those being that lands that are brought into the ocean shore and are in public ownership, the state is not to be alienate those. So when we look at disposing of properties, or other agencies look at disposing of properties on the ocean shore, really the intent is to try to keep those in that public ownership, right? And the other part is when we manage the ocean shore, we manage them as we do our other lands. And so again, you heard earlier with the discussion on the drones, the ocean shore rulemaking is happening because it's a state recreation area and we manage it the same way. So that's where we're rolling those into this. Does anybody have any questions on what we've covered so far? Like I said, please feel free to ask as we go along. So going through, as I said, the statute's fairly long. What I did is I went through and I pulled out a lot of the key, I'll call them key directives that are in there. And these are split up between several different sections, and you can see I have a reference up on top, but I really wanted to just share these. They are out of context, but being able to share just kind of those key statements as takeaways, because again, I think they open up a little dialogue for us later on this afternoon. Some of these we've already talked about. Oops, so I apologize. We've already talked about number one, doing whatever is necessary to preserve that, managing as a state recreation area, preserving the rights for the public, the recreational area, and the owners, preserving that ownership. The other part really dives into the public use and maintaining and protecting that public use. And as you'll see on this next slide, it really goes down to kind of how we administer that and how we regulate that public use. And that's really more of what these sessions this afternoon are going to cover, but it's controlling and regulating these alterations, right? And an alteration, really think of it as anything disturbing the ocean shore. If you're excavating, if you're filling, if you're moving sand around, that's the basic definition of an alteration. But then we also have the recreational management side of it as well, because we're managing it as a state recreation area. Again, today, we're going to be talking a lot about the alterations. But as we're doing that, public access, free and uninterrupted use, improving access where we can, and then promoting generally the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and then even looking at the values around it. As we all know, our Oregon coast is very beautiful. A lot of that is because of those values that are on and around the ocean shore. And so really working to look at these broader questions that are out there so that we can preserve the beauty that is our ocean shore, and really support that recreational value that comes from just having these beautiful stretches of coastline. Yes, Commissioner.
So just backing up a little bit, and I hate getting this far in the weeds, but I'm curious. Is public use described somewhere? This says, provide, your words probably, but provide the free use and then uninterrupted use. What use? Is that defined? And does that make a difference?
So I know we do have a little bit in rule. Steve,
Yes.
you might be better to answer that
Okay.
one too, about does the term recreation and how that, and that free and uninterrupted use, and that, how is that defined out there?
It's not necessarily defined in rule or statute, but what we would look at there is historically when we've found something to interrupt or the free exercise, it's been more like in the situation in Cannon Beach where they erected a fence that closed out a area of what the public had a customary right to use and tried to exclude the public from that area. So something like that, or if you were to choose to erect a structure and seek a permit for that, that would interfere with the public's ability to use the dry sand areas. So it's not something we have defined in rule, and I don't think I would recommend trying to define it in rule. It's more a we know it when we see it type thing.
That's workshop one. I would entertain any dialogue if you want to talk kind of about our legal context and or statutory context of the Ocean Shore program. If you have any questions, we will talk more history and that type of stuff later on. Anybody has any other questions? All right. And just for context, the photo here is actually during the beach bill when there was school groups, other entities out all advocating for our beaches. So it's important to remember that it wasn't always the way we have it today, and that there was a fight that came on to preserve those public rights. All right, Tyler. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler.
Good afternoon, Commission. I'm Tyler Blanchett, the Ocean Shore Permit Coordinator. Today, me and Kevin are going to kind of tag team a little bit and talk about construction impacts and kind of the stuff we're seeing when some of these projects are getting built out there on the beach. We're going to go through some of the resource impacts and recreation impacts and things like that. So for any person that wants to build something on the beach, they have to get a permit through our agency, and we have to grant that permit. That is typically a 60-day process, but it can be extended out past 120 days, depending on if there is like a public hearing or if the decision is appealed, things of that nature. The pre-application period can take much longer, though, as we work with applicants to try to find a suitable project that balances that impact to the resource with the appropriate the need for the project. So the applicant has to demonstrate all of that information in their application. It can't just be something that we know or talk about on the phone. It has to be something that they demonstrate in their application. Part of that is because our application is reviewed by the public. We do have a 30-day public review period where the public can comment and give feedback regarding the project and whether or not they believe it meets our rules or not. So one of the things we look at, which is the kind of central point or central criteria for a project to occur on or alter the ocean shore, is that adequate justification piece. Without adequate justification, there's no need for the project to occur. And pretty much all elements of the application kind of rotate around this sort of central point of need for the project. So, for example, property owner wants to construct a shoreline protective structure. There has to be a demonstrated need to protect that property. They need to have an erosion situation. They don't need to have an accretion situation. And then they need to demonstrate that erosion situation is going to be a threat to their property. And then we work with the applicant to try to come up with a project that minimizes those impacts on onto the ocean shore, which could be limiting the scope or scale. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh, I'll keep going. Okay, yeah, limiting the scope or scale of the project. Which could be reducing the size of the shoreline protective structure, for example, if you're talking about shoreline protective structures. And it also would incorporate like scenic values and things like that. So we're looking for a more natural type of appearance instead of something maybe like you guys saw earlier with a more unnatural appearance like a seawall.
So when you look, go back.
Yep.
So yeah, least impact obviously for us would be for them to move the home back. How do you decide on what the impact, like what that impact is? Because obviously most people aren't moving their homes back. There's something in between there. Is there a cost benefit ratio that you look at? How do you determine what that leads to, and maybe the longevity of that too? I mean, 2 years of vegetation versus a seawall that's going to last 100 years.
Yes, but Chair Hill, the part of it is currently, again, we talked about rulemaking, is some of our rules are fairly limited on that. There is direction in the current rule of what's called avoiding the hazard, and there needs to be a look at that. And cost is one aspect. They have to demonstrate that cost as a criteria. What we've been seeing, and is what you'll see later on, is that moving the house or looking at the alternative hasn't necessarily been fully evaluated as deeply in the past. And so really what the sequencing that the laws lay out is that you should be looking at, well, if you can move your house away, well, then you move your house away. You don't need a permit from us, but you've also eliminated the threat, right? So now there's both a benefit to the public, right? And there's a benefit to you as a landowner. Where that becomes touchy is where you've got the situation where there's say not enough property to move the house forward or something of that nature. And now you've got erosion up to the back of the house. What do you do? Because there's very limited options in those situations. And so there is a huge spectrum, and it's really site specific. What we're working on is both the rules to help explain that to applicants and for staff to have consistency, but also guidance and information on, being preventative, maybe when you still have shoreline between you and your house, doing things to slow that erosion rate versus waiting till your house is ready to fall in effectively and coming in with the hardest structure. So there is definitely a balancing act in there. Unfortunately, the rules are not real clear, which is part of why we need to update those and provide clear guidance to the applicants on that, because it is expensive to move houses, but it's also expensive to put in armoring.
Yes. Do you know of a situation in which we've denied a permit and recommended that they move their property back or move their structure back?
We have actually had a couple of cases where we've worked with the applicants and they've moved back their house before even applying for a permit. So
helpful feedback.
It hasn't been very often.
Ideally, we would work with the applicant to try to avoid that denial process where we would go into it eyes wide open and say, hey, look, it looks like moving your house is a reasonable alternative. So instead of going through the process, paying an application fee and then getting to a no, our best case scenario would always be that we would talk them out of that instead of getting to that point.
So I love the idea of moving the house, but the reaction to that suggestion has got to be unbelievable. You want me to do what? I admire you if you offer that as a solution, but wow.
Absolutely. Commissioner Grassi, and we see that because I think I was talking to you on the beach, is that it can be, my parents built it in this location, so there's that tied to it, or they specifically bought it for that view. And moving that changes that dynamic. But in reality, it is probably in their best interest long-term to move back further. I mean, the ocean is not in most cases on the ocean shore is not moving to the west, it's moving to the east. And so again, it is a difficult conversation though, and there's a lot that goes into that. As I mentioned though, shoreline armoring is not maybe always a panacea either. There is maintenance required. They are quite expensive. I mean, we're seeing for 50-foot wide lots, it can be $100,000 to $200,000 plus for a treatment. And then you can be looking at some of the literature says 10 to 20% for amortized annual maintenance costs on that. So again, you look at that, it gets fairly expensive over time. So again, that's part of that discussion and why there needs to be that upfront dialogue with the applicants. Well, we've been seeing a lot of the parcels, there's just no room. So that conversation of moving your house becomes, is there another parcel somewhere else that you'd rather go to? And that's even a more difficult dialogue, because then it's not necessarily conducive, because the roads might not be big enough to move something like that. There's just so many logistical issues that come up. So again, that's part of that upfront dialogue that Tyler was talking about.
Yeah.
It's why, really why Harney County built the big dike between us and the ocean called the Cascades. To slow this down.
And just to kind of leapfrog a little bit off of Kevin's point, in regards to having those conversations, a lot of these revetments, it's not uncommon for 50 or 60 foot of revetment to cost between like $200,000 to $300,000. So that's going back to that balance of like, okay, how much is it going to cost you to do a revetment versus how much is it going to cost you to relocate your house possibly. So it's not that always these revetments are super cheap either. So
I've got to believe that moving a home is not cheap either.
Right.
And then
100%.
I know in some situations, if the erosion continues, I can't imagine that you can tell somebody to move their house twice.
If we could get them before they're built.
yeah, I don't know if there's been a question where we've gotten them to, or I'm not sure if there was a question there, but to your point,
I guess I was curious.
I'm not sure if we've gotten to like had to move your house twice. Hopefully they would move it for enough back.
Or move it and sell it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so just kind of continuing that conversation about alternatives analysis and what can we do during the application process to work with the potential permittee or applicant to minimize those impacts. So one of those things is reducing the amount of space that the project uses that encroaches out onto the ocean shore, whether that's a stairway or a revetment shoreline protective structure. We encourage applicants to, when reasonable, shift the alignment of the structure landward as much as they can. And that minimizes the amount of encroachment out onto the dry sands of the beach, which allows for more public use.
Have you seen a solution in hardening that line that actually works when you think long-term, 50 or 100 years? Is there anything that does work? Or are they Band-Aids?
Yeah, I'd say anything that interacts with the Pacific Ocean is probably temporary. Yeah, I think it's permanent is relative, I would say, because even the riprap revetment structures that we permit are not uncommon for us to permit, they do need repairs. Even the newer ones, the bigger, newer, subject matter experts tell you this is the latest and greatest design, and then 2 years later they got to repair it. So that is kind of the reality of it.
And I think to add to that, in one of my past positions, I worked very closely with an engineer that in particular looked at working on large projects on large riverine systems. And one of the kind of pieces of advice he said is, whenever you build something, gray infrastructure, whether it's concrete, whether it's wrought wall, riprap wall, the moment you put it in is the strongest it's ever going to be. it's always wearing down after that. And so at some point, it wears down and either needs to be repaired, replaced, you know, that type of thing. And that becomes that longer dialogue that we were talking about out on the beach, where there is this make it bigger. Well, that making it bigger and stronger allows that maintenance not to be as critical or as necessary, because you have a little bit more give. So again, there's that, and again, that goes, where are we at on that balancing scale of that longevity? But yeah, as Tyler said, I mean, if we look long term and you go through all the different predictions, whether it's the increased storm events, whether it's tsunami, whether these things are going to need to be repaired, replaced, and could be, you know, taken out and end up as piles of rubble on the beach with some of these events, whether it's seismic or tsunami based. I mean, there's a lot of what ifs that are out there, but the moral of the story is they're getting weaker every year they're in.
I think I have a clarifying question as all. So just so I understand, if you didn't have development prior to 1977, then your only option is to move the house. Is that correct? Or is that, am I oversimplifying?
Yeah, I'm gonna go in the remote here. I'm gonna go back to this. So yeah, and I actually have a different graphic that has the goal 18 side. I should have brought it. This line right here in the middle, basically, if you were built post 1977, this is all you can look at as options. And so moving your house, if you can do some sort of vegetative, and vegetative can be a broader term, a nature-based solution. And then there's also a dynamic revetment, which Washington's been doing more dynamic based, and they're having a lot of success. But there are drawbacks to them. We do have a lot of natural dynamic revetments on the Oregon coast, especially like Arch Cape, some of those places. But where we were today, those are open sand beaches with sand cliffs, you know, bluffs behind it. You'd basically bring in a lot of cobble that would extend way out on the beach. So it would change the function and feature of the beach, but it would be one type of rock versus a riprap. So again, it's probably more usable, but there's drawbacks on all of these. Goal 18, you can, you need to still start over here, but you can at least pursue some of these other options over here. What we're trying to have people look at is more of this hybrid approach. Instead of going all the way to the right-hand side of the scale and going the hardest you can, is how do you integrate vegetation? How do you integrate some of these other techniques to minimize the visual impacts or some of those other aspects?
Okay.
But does that help?
Thank you. That helps a lot. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, as you're familiar with, Commissioner, the prohibition in Goal 18 is subject to the exception process as well. So there are properties that are ineligible that go through the Goal 18 exception process and then have the right to pursue the more hard structures.
So in the worst case scenario, we have the 9.0 and all of this is gone. What do our rules say about, I want to go build a house back where grandpa's house was? Is that a dare?
I have those rules, but nobody's seen them.
Wait till that happens.
You're saving them for Cascadia.
Right here.
I think that goes back to where we need to be working with our partners, because a lot of that decision is going to happen through statewide planning goals and the local county land use planning departments. And I think that's part of this broader discussion that needs to happen on, again, I'll kind of segue into this afternoon, but it's really this partnership discussion of how do we start looking forward and not just at what's happening today.
So the new slide here, this is some of the criteria we have to evaluate for when we write a findings of fact and work with the applicants to explain how their project is going to meet these standards that are on the screen. It's pretty complex for some of these, particularly the archaeological and cultural resource stuff. Some of the things are a little bit more straightforward as far as views and compatibility with surroundings. For example, is there a lot of shoreline armoring already in this littoral cell, or is this kind of a more pristine area? Safety, things like that. We try to work with contractors to minimize safety and when they can stage off the ocean shore, to minimize that amount of time that there's equipment operating on the beach. So when they can, hopefully work from the upland or whatever they need to do to minimize just that opportunity for contact with the public. So yeah, that's a good segue into this slide. Kind of jumped the gun a little bit. So yeah, here's a picture of Cannon Beach with a lot of folks out there playing. And then at the bottom of the screen is heavy equipment out on the beach, taking care of a project, post permitting. So these are some of the kind of issues that we're challenged by when we do permitting, is public safety, public use, and enforcement of those elements of the permit conditions. So a lot of times we'll have a condition where we require the operators to submit safety photos, things like that. This is them demonstrating covering up a hole on the North Coast. So these are things we want to try to avoid for sure. As you can tell, it's very busy, and there's a lot of people moving around. But it's really hard for us with the kind of staff and rules we have now to have enforcement with these sorts of situations, because it's kind of after the fact. And so that opportunity to kind of give the education is passed, if they're not kind of caught in the act, and then they submit these types of post-project photos afterwards. This is Lincoln County here. This is one of the, this is a couple photos of some bigger projects. So here you see a lot of riprap and heavy equipment blocking north-south travel along the beach. They've got sand stockpiled out on the beach, kind of to the west, which is interacting with the surf line there on the bottom photo. So you're actually severing that access for emergency vehicles or even state parks to get down the beach. So these are the types of things that we want to avoid. Unfortunately, it's hard to be out there every second of the day since we have 362 miles of coastline. It's just really hard to kind of keep your finger on everything. But that bottom picture is definitely a least desirable scenario for us, and would likely trigger enforcement action.
And this is what we were talking about out on site, where they take and pile the sand up as a kind of a surf protection berm. It's also the sand they plan on using to backfill their hole and face the revetment with. But as you can see, the surf has actively been engaging with this seaward edge. So other than at a lower tide, this does block all access. That was the same thing on this site. And this was actually their haul road, and that was the only place the public could walk, was right through their construction site. So again, these are the types of things we're seeing as they're building these structures. And sometimes these are on the beach for months under the proposals that they send to us. So again, it's not just, oh, they're out there for a couple days doing it. That's a month or two. And we've had some, they've been working on the beach for, many, many months.
So is that unforeseen? Are they not telling you that's what they're going to have to do or want to do?
So historically, we weren't asking a lot of the questions on the construction. Over the last couple of years, it's something that Tyler and I have really been starting to ask more about this. As I mentioned on the beach, this is a lot of times what we're seeing as being the actual issue. It's not necessarily the construction of the revetment, it's all the other stuff, and you'll see more of those later. But yeah, we are actively asking more of those questions now.
Okay. Yeah, so this is kind of an example of the kind of after the fact, once the equipment's off the beach and everybody goes home. This is sort of what we're left with here is a lot of times in these areas where the bluff has been eroded and they justify the need for this shoreline armoring. Effectively what you have here is now the beach. I mean, now the ocean is coming up, and instead of interacting with the bluff and allowing the bluff to kind of migrate and erode, now it's just bumping up against a hard fixed shoreline protective structure. So that also reduces the amount of sand available to the littoral cell because it locks up through the eroding bluff. So now you actually get kind of a shortened, narrower beach. And so as time passes, even during times of mid and lower tides, you actually have less and less access as time goes on, as the result of these sort of large scale shoreline armoring, sort of systematic shoreline armoring projects.
Are you seeing situations where a homeowner, like that example, has land that's not impacted today and just decides to dig a trench and build himself a wall that's well outside of our authority? Is that happening? And then eventually it reaches that? And what do you do?
So there have been some recent cases, but I'm gonna defer to Steve, counsel on that. There have been some challenges. I believe it was in Tillamook County where there've been some preemptive structures built back off the ocean shore, which obviously is in our jurisdiction. And I believe they've had some appeals and that related to that. So I'll
Yeah, so the situation is that if they build something back, but then there's erosion and then that structure is exposed, it's a structure that is then on the ocean shore that's unpermitted. So it's an unauthorized structure on the ocean shore. And we're in a role where we, perhaps have to do an enforcement action, or they may try to permit it now that it's on the ocean shore. But that's just kind of the nature of a dynamic environment like that, where the factual circumstances about the land can change and bring something into our jurisdiction.
But haven't there been some appeals related to some preemptive through the county land use planning processes?
There were definitely the project in Tillamook County went through land use approval and remand and approval and remand and approval and yeah. But that didn't involve parks.
Yeah, that's correct.
At that point, because it was not jurisdictional of parks yet.
Hmm.
It might be someday.
Could be.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, and so one of the things that also comes up around on different areas of the ocean shore, as we mentioned earlier, that the one part is some of these projects are at or on. This is a very unique case. I don't want to use this as an example necessarily of what happens, but it's how weird certain things can happen. The homeowner is on a spit, happens to be a chunk of state park land that goes right up to their house. And if you notice the shape, basically they built their house into that little alcove in there. The proposal effectively is on our property and that, or has a chunk on our property. So again, that adds to that complexity of, it's not just an ocean shore question now, it's actually a parks ownership question. And do we want to allow structures like this on our property? Because there's potentially, future obligations, future maintenance issues, whatever that is. How do we deal with that? And this site happens to have some other resource concerns that are at it, some visual concerns. So there's a lot of elements to this, but these are the conversations we're having with the landowners and their consultants, where their consultant just basically says, hey, we need to protect this structure, period. And it's a very difficult discussion because there is potentially room to move that home back and further away from Opierity property to where it wouldn't be currently a question. Now, in the future, there may be a question, but right now their solution was, well, we want to keep it all here and we want to add a structure in. Well, again, it's extremely complicated because of the resource and regulatory complications. So I bring that up more as these are the realities that we're seeing. It's not just an ocean shore question all the time. Sometimes it's an ownership question too. Yeah, go ahead. So on our, as you saw in those photos up on top there, repeats, but this just gives you an extent of some of these work areas that extend potentially 100 feet or more. We happen to get lucky with some of our aerial imagery, but you know, they're extending 100 feet or more out onto the ocean shore. And in order to isolate these areas, as we talked about before, it's a pretty significant area. It sometimes involves multiple landowners, and it definitely blocks public access.
Yeah, so this slide is kind of about construction work area safety. Right now we have, hope it's okay for me to say this, Steve. We have kind of very non-specific criteria for our construction work area safety. We're trying to improve that through having the contractors now submit us like a construction safety plan for what are they going to do to kind of block off the area that they're going to be working in. But these activities take a long time, and for most of these shoreline protection projects, it's critical for the structure for them to actually dig down and reach a hard pan to actually tie the toe of the structure into. So a lot of these, when the project is justified, a lot of these this portion of the project is unavoidable. So what we have is a lot of these toe trenches that are potentially get filled with water and things like that. So we just want to minimize the amount of time that trench is open and that area is kind of exposed. So
and to put this in perspective, these banks here are probably 5 to 10 feet. It's actually a little higher on this end. They're very steep. If you fell in there, there's no way you're climbing out. That water is several feet deep. You know, some of these holes are going 6 to 10 feet below the mean sea level, and so again, it's obviously filled in with sand and that, but they can be several feet deep and really hard to get out of. There'll also be some blind sinkholes where, like, when they backfill over the riprap, where it can be a void, and if you step on it, we've had actually people call in and have fallen into these holes that have formed after the project site has been kind of been put to bed.
Yeah, so one thing we've been working with contractors on is trying to improve like signage and things like that. So that's kind of what you're seeing here, just alerting the public of an active construction site before they get right up to it. Unfortunately, people are curious. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, people are curious. So they want to know what's going on. For example, at your second site that you guys stopped at, we worked with the contractor there to put up some signage that would alert folks that use that park that there would be, when they went down onto the beach, that there would be construction activity going on and that they needed to be aware of that activity. It's not an issue everywhere in some of the more remote areas or areas that are not adjacent to a park. We encourage folks to like put up signs right there wherever they're using the beach access at. Yeah, go ahead.
So staging areas, you'll hear us use this term. Really, this is where they transfer material from on-highway dump trucks to off-highway dump trucks. And you'll see what I mean by an off-highway dump truck in the video shortly. Really, these staging areas are one of the things that, if you had asked Tyler or I a couple of years ago before we started, where we would have the most problems, it wasn't staging areas, but the one place that has been the most contentious has been staging areas. And a lot of times there's multiple points for that. One is they're typically located at a public access point. The other is you're typically on somebody else's ownership onto the ocean shore. And the third is that it's really a transfer area. So there's a lot of equipment use. Oh, end of the day, whatever it is, whatever's there stays there unattended overnight, sometimes for a week or two. There's just a lot of things that happen. And with that transfer of material, the upland landowners, all they hear is rock dumping, equipment running, vibrations. We've had reports of, people saying that their sheetrock nails are coming out and other things because you're dumping 4-foot plus diameter boulders and out there. And so there's just a lot of different complaints that come in. These have been one of the really eye-opening pieces of our program. So historically was on beach. We're starting to work with applicants. Look, this was an off beach, again, minimizing impacts, right? If the staging area is not on the beach, that's not within our jurisdiction. Some project sites, they also kind of do a hybrid where some of it's off beach, some of it's on beach. And we're going to talk a lot about what the on beach issues of these work areas, because basically these contractors come out, well, then it's, well, I don't want my material to wash away. So I take the big rock that I'm going to use and pile it around and create really a kind of a mini riprap area, which creates different erosion. And then they bring in fill rock because the sand is loose. So they end up having this fill rock in it. Or as I mentioned out on site, this is one of those parking pads that I mentioned. It was because they were working during the winter, they brought in rock, they brought in fill. This was not within the permit. But because they couldn't take the equipment back up and park it on the street, they wanted to park it on the beach. The tide was coming in, so they built a ramp, which creates a lot of issues. Things like this was a huge ramp that was built down with a lot of the pit run that was going to be eventually used for backing and some of the riprap. This is that same one you saw earlier. Just a lot of loose material. You can see it spilling onto the beach. They have equipment parked up on top. Stockpiles have a lot of loose material, a lot of things that are both available for the waves to potentially move around, but also for the kids to climb on. And these things are not settled in, they're just loosely dumped. So there's a safety issue. And really the only demarcation you've had since we've been trying to work with the contractors to kind of demarcate is to maybe put a row of boulders around and sometimes have some signs, some very simple signs that say keep away, stay off. We're trying to work with them on actually maintaining that signage and keeping it clear that this is something hasn't been extremely successful, and partly because of the dynamic nature. Signs wash away, they blow away. It's really tough to keep that type of stuff out on the ocean shore. This happens to be a staging area near where we were at today. As you can see, the member of the public walking through between the equipment continues to operate, continue to load the construction equipment. You'll see a different photo in a little bit here. Nobody gets out, nobody talks to them. In all of their applications, at least in this area, the applicant said, hey, we have spotters, we stop the equipment, we get out, we talk to the public, it's not an issue. Public access point is right here. And like I said, you'll see the picture here. This is that same public access point. The truck and the excavator were parked right over here. As a member of the public, how do you know that's an access point? I mean, it doesn't look like it's open. And these are the questions we're starting to have, or we've been having the last couple of years with our contractors saying, this isn't okay because the public has no idea how to get on or off the beach. But this is convenient for the contractors because it's right at that transition from the highway to the beach. Member of the public walking down, you looking straight at the side of an excavator. Do you think you can walk down that and get to the beach or not? You start having that question, especially if it's operating, if it's moving material. How do you get around that? So these are some of the real issues that we're having with our talking to our contractors, trying to educate them that protection of the public is part of our permitting. It's not just a blank check to use the beach as how you see fit to do your construction operations. This one here, you'll notice the warning sign. It actually says warning, basically stay out. Well, it's facing the access point. Access point is behind where I'm taking the picture. You're supposed to stay off the beach. What is that? Where are we looking at? And you've got material pile on here. This is also one of the main emergency vehicle access points. The way this was set up, if you were in an emergency vehicle, you would have had to go around and then turn and come through effectively drifts of sand. It would have been extremely difficult for any emergency vehicle to go south from this point. And we have things like sedimentation, pollution, other things from these on-beach work areas. And we're really trying to work actively to start limiting this stuff down, because ultimately what you have when high waves, winter surf events come in, these staging areas get blown out. This is Pit Run. They had brought in they use it as backing material behind the large riprap. And this, I believe it was almost 300 feet down the beach from the staging area, because we had a winter storm series come in. It washed over. This is that same wall you saw earlier where they had backfilled it with the Pit Run. And it just scattered it up and down the beach. And we got quite a few calls from the public. We ended up working with the contractor and got him out there to clean it all up. They were done with the project that this was, the staging area was used for. Their intent was, well, we're just going to keep this here because we'll have another project in the future. And so again, trying to change that mindset of, no, if we tell you can do this, it's a temporary piece, right? It's not a permanent investment on the ocean shore. And then we have these haul routes that are out there. Haul routes don't necessarily sound like a lot, but these are heavy, large equipment, and you get deep ruts, and we have resources under the sand stumps, things of that nature that are a concern. So now we get the fun video. So this is me standing out on the beach. I took about 3 paces away from the track, did not make eye contact, just was standing there. Vehicle did not slow down, didn't have a signal, didn't do anything. A little bit concerning that these tires are like 5-6 foot. I mean, they're huge tires, maybe 4 foot, but it's a large vehicle out there. And this is where we were standing today. This was the beach access point out at Glen Eden. This is what I was talking about, where they were hammerhead turning around. And I'll point out, there is no backup alarm. There's no spotter. There's nothing else. And this is on one of the projects that had a lot of signage. And these happen to be members of the public that walked down from the state park.
Kevin, I know it's not your job, but this, we've talked about this all day, how many state agencies are involved in these kind of things. That's clearly an OSHA violation to not have a backup alarm.
So we have been having some discussions about how we need to approach that and look at those, because some of the dialogue we've had with the construction sites, you saw the open pits, things of that nature. So we've actually been talking to our risk folks about how do we start engaging OSHA and other entities. Once we actually have another construction project, we'll probably be having some more dialogue with them to have some more critical discussions about how do we permit what do we do to avoid these things from happening.
Is it possible, like, are there any options to just not grant the permit? Like, just seeing the videos and the large holes being dug, I have concerns about safety of the public falling into, what looks now like a swimming pool without a lifeguard. And then also just like the resource use required to clean up the site.
So I would say I'd look to Steve a little bit, but from what I've read, I would say yes. The answer is yes, but as an agency, that we've been allowing these to happen. And so part of it is what we've been doing is trying to document and trying to figure out how do we work with and educate to see what we can do. But yeah, there definitely is some ways that we probably could narrow down that. And again, that'll be part of our future discussion as we go into rulemaking and look at some of the policies decisions that want to be made.
I know that it's really challenging and contentious, but I'm thinking back to the very first slide that you presented around protecting these resources for future generations and perpetuity through all means necessary. And it seems like that, it's really, it really benefits the homeowner, right? Because they're trying to protect their home and improve it, but at a cost to the public.
I mean, we do have standards for considerations in issuing a permit for things like recreational impact, scenic impact, things like that. Um, as Kevin alluded to earlier today, we've thought of that generally as looking at the project, and now that we're including the impact during the time of construction as part of that consideration. And is there a less impact way to perform the construction work aspect of it? And yes, I think that's within our permit purview.
And I would also point out that yes, this is serious, but at the same time, if these houses start coming into the ocean, it's
Right.
going to be a much bigger issue, right? So we are in this place and we do have to do what we need to do to balance. But as you heard earlier, when somebody said you only have 10 people, there was a long time in my career, which is only 17 years, there was one. And so we have over the course of the last 5 years started paying much closer attention to how we're permitting these and what those requirements and those conditions are. And you can feel it. I mean, across my desk the last year, even people are like, but for the last 25 years, we've been able to do this. And it's like, and we can't do that anymore just because we were doing it the way we were doing it and not paying attention and didn't have the resources. We do need to think about this differently before somebody gets injured, killed, or a house falls off a cliff. So I don't know that it's as dire as it feels in the moment because you're seeing all the worst case pieces here. And at the same time, we have an obligation because there are structures here that if they fell into the ocean, I don't know what that's going to look like either and how expensive that's going to be. But we're on it. We're just going to need your support as we start shifting to say maybe we could stage somewhere else and do things from upland versus down on the ocean shore. People are like, but we've always been able to do it. Yep. And you used to come into the ODOT office and get dynamite and blow out ditch canals too. We don't do that anymore. So we're just kind of setting the future direction. And I think that feels different for folks. So yeah, there's a lot of these right now.
And commissioners, I mean, I think the kind of going back to that is part of what I'm saying is we have that discussion through rulemaking because they're going to be people that are very passionate of don't do any construction. There's going to be people that say, we've always done this. You have to protect every house. And it's the private property rights versus the public rights, as I've said along. And I think that's where, as we're developing the rules, what we're trying to show here as Director Assumption indicated was these are the worst case scenarios, but the problem is that a lot of these have been kind of the standard that we're seeing. And so while these are worst case scenario, these were from the active projects over the last 2 years. Every single project had one or two major issues with it, if at least. And so it goes back to how do we develop the standards such that we have OSHA being covered, we have public safety being covered, we have all of these nuances so that when the equipment is operating on the ocean shore, when it's determined that it's the only viable option, that it has to be done in this way or not at all. You know, that's the type of stuff that we need to be looking at. It's no longer kind of this, well, it's just the easier way to do it that way. But that's not the right way to do it. So that's a lot of the dialogue, but that is going to be a paradigm shift. And I will say over the last couple of years, 2.5 years, it's been a painful push to try to have those conversations. And we've all been in the middle of them. And, because a lot of these have resulted at least in educational contacts, and those contacts are usually pretty heated. And a lot of opinions of we shouldn't have to do that. You can't ask us to do that kind of rhetoric. And that's been challenging to try to educate everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciate the complexity of it and I'm really grateful that you're all doing the work and not me going up there doing the education.
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of other types of requests we get are for vegetation removal, including mowing, things like that, trimming material to kind of improve access and also invasive species abatement and things of that nature. Some of these activities are permitted, but some are not. That's one of the kind of tricky things we deal with, particularly in areas that are accreting. Oh, that's the next slide. Okay, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so in the bottom on the bottom there, that's on the north coast. We have a dune that is actually building. So the property owners, their property extends out to that meander line of the Pacific Ocean. So even though our statutory vegetation line was surveyed, oh, which one is it? This one. Our statutory vegetation line here was surveyed in 67. That dune has continued to build. So there is kind of a misconception that their property, that all of their unhindered property rights, extend out to the dry sands, but that's not true because our recreational use and authority here extends to that statutory vegetation line. So we have a lot of educational conversations about where our permitting authority begins and ends, and also unfortunately some of those situations do end up with compliance issues, particularly for cutting vegetation without a permit and operating a vehicle like a tractor without a permit. Any questions on that?
So today, while we were down on the beach, I see ODOT beating the brush off the side of the right of way. Are they having to get a permit? In some cases?
If they were on the ocean shore, yes, but ODOT typically is going to be up high enough that they would be within the right of way, and that most of the right of way would be off the ocean shore. But as Tyler, just to kind of add on here, one of the compounding thing, if you notice, it's mowed on the ocean shore. It's not mowed here. A lot of the dialogue between that has been, well, we're doing it for fire safety. We're doing it because they've seen homeless camping. We're doing it because of the view. There's a lot of those landowner benefits, but when they talk about mowing that for fire, but yet they don't mow right up to their homes. And so there's this little bit of a question that we're having. And as an agency, we've never really tackled this systematically. We have a rule that says you can't cut vegetation without state parks permission. And that's effectively as deep as it goes. So we've actually, as a team, been trying to talk of saying, but under what conditions do we actually say yes? Or is it just an outright no? Or is it, what is it along that spectrum? Because some of these individuals have been mowing for decades and nobody said anything to them. And so we're now starting to have those dialogues now that we've got the capacity, and our beach rangers are seeing this mowing happening and bringing it up and making these contacts.
Okay. Yeah, so there, like Kevin said, there's a number of different justifications for vegetation removal or invasive species abatement, things like that. So there is reasonable justification for these activities. It's just trying to sort of triage which ones are real justification and which ones are just kind of folks wanting to kind of have a manicured, unnatural area. For example, on the South Coast, particularly, we have a lot of gorse along the bluffs adjacent to the ocean shore. One of the trickier issues, though, that we have to sort of balance with that, though, is also in some of these areas, it's unexpected, but there's a lot of cultural resources in some of these areas. So while it may seem as simple as, oh, just drive out on the beach and mulch the gorse and then take off, it's actually a little bit trickier than that due to some of the cultural resources and things like that in the area, where it's not just like, oh yeah, drive your track hoe out there with your brush cutter on the head and knock it out. That could get into a violation of federal and state law if we were to permit that. So kind of navigating that with contractors and local jurisdictions and homeowners is a little bit tricky sometimes, having to kind of explain the complexities of, it's not just as easy to drive down the beach with your weed whacker. You want to take this one?
Yeah, take the examples.
Yeah.
So we talked on the beach a little bit about some of the examples that are out there. This happens to be where we were at earlier. But just going to give you some examples of kind of what we see proposed, and just to kind of stir that discussion of what is reasonable, what is it within that balance. So this one, third of a mile, I was mentioned off the beach staging area, third of a mile, came onto the state park. There were special use permits for weddings not issued for the time period that they were proposing work. And then the turnaround area, but the haul route went right through our state park and then the work area. Again, it's not that, it's a third of a mile. Is that far enough or not? There's a lot of questions that come into that. Things like moving the project site back. There's actually several acres of property, whether or not, is there enough room to actually move something back? And is that consistent with the use that was intended and the views that were intended when that was built? There's a lot of questions, but the big one is we have a state park right here. And what are those potential impacts to the state park ownership? Another one is there was an example of a proposal or request, I should say, that wanted to access the beach from 2.2 miles away, haul up the beach, all the material up the beach, so multiple multiple round trips per day. There we go. Sorry, to bring material to the work site across a state park, as well as you'll see in some of these insets, there are several streams and even ancient forest remnants that are under the beach. And so there's this question of, is that reasonable to actually look at somebody having construction equipment driving up and down 2.2 miles of beach in a fairly heavily used area across multiple landowners ships as well?
Kevin, are you seeing individuals complaining that somebody's driving across my place, and what do you do about it?
So that's kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier on some of the staging areas in particular, but yes, having construction equipment in front has been generating an inordinate amount of phone calls and consternation with us. Primarily, we've been improving and trying to notify more of these landowners during our process, because before we were only, the rule only has the landowner to the north and the south. That was being interpreted of the revetment. We're looking at, but it does say the project area. And so we're actually talking about the haul route being the project area, and that we're notifying those landowners along the way too, so they understand that. So that I think that's going to help, but it's, again, just letting people understand it is or has been a problem though, having the construction equipment out in front.
Can I add one thing right quick, Kevin? Yeah, one thing I was going to say that's hard to kind of capture in these slideshows and in videos is the amount of noise that's generated by these projects. There's a serious amount of noise pollution created by this heavy equipment picking up these rocks. I mean, some of these rocks are over 1,500 pounds. So picking these rocks up, dropping them, and then just the constant sort of shuffle of moving these rocks around and banging against each other, and then kind of moving them from place to place. So you've got kind of two main disturbance points. You've got the staging and the transfer location wherever your beach access is, and then you've got your travel along the beach, and then you've actually got the dumping the rocks back off again and the shuffling around of the rocks again. So you kind of have two kind of focal points of disturbance there with noise.
So how many of these permits are you issuing a year, roughly?
So for the last, they look back 10 years, I think we're averaging 24, I think is what, something like that, of full alteration permits that we've been issuing, something of that nature. It's been ranging between, I think, 12 and 30, something like that. But yeah, I think the average of our permit workload has been about 20, 25, something like
Okay.
that. So
Thanks.
again, final kind of example here is happens to be proposal was to bring a staging area that happens to be out in front of a motel out of state park, at a very heavily used public access point and emergency access point, hauling north up to a project site. Not a very far distance, but this is the picture in the summer, and they wanted to do it in the summer, and this is a picture on a summer weekday. This isn't even a weekend, this is a weekday picture. It's really challenging to have a dialogue with the contractor of how do you do this safely, and how do you inform the public, and how do we restrict the public without restricting the public to make it safe. And that's a really big challenge to have those dialogues in areas like this, because that is extremely difficult. And if you notice this aerial image, every one of these dots is beach blanket, person, umbrella, whatever it is. And you can see they're all over and it looks just like this. That's not an atypical situation here. Oh, and then I'll add to this one. One of the things we have mentioned about the ownership on the ocean shore, just to kind of lay in the complexity, we rely heavily on the tax assessor maps, which is not an ownership map, but that's the best thing the counties have for us to look at. But in several parcels like this, they actually show up as an unknown ownership, whether it's blank, whether it says something like the public or this the citizens, I think is one we've seen, Citizens of Oregon. There's some really weird things out there. Well, on that type of thing, one of our regulations relates to if we don't know, if we have to secure permission from the underlying landowner before we can issue a permit. Well, how do you do that when you don't know who the landowner is? And so there's some real complexities that we end up facing on a day-to-day basis. This is that same photo I showed you for just this closer. So really, as I mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned throughout this presentation, it's really this balance of building these structures, having construction equipment on the beach is a balance with our recreation. How do we balance that? Where is that right? The right place to be. All right. That is the end of workshop 2.
I do want to have like one kind of closing comment back to Commissioner Cribben's question about how many of these projects do we have. That's probably how many shoreline protection projects we have. We have a significant number of other projects that we use an alteration waiver. So most abundantly would be remedial grading. So we probably issue in this past year, we've probably done 60 remedial grading authorizations, which includes the contractor takes the sand from that accumulates around the houses, and then they dig that sand out from around the house, and then they go dump it back out onto the beach. So that's a pretty significant disturbance. So we don't actually go through the full alteration permit process for that, where we have the public review and opportunity for hearing. We just go all the way. We just say, okay, this is a less impact because it meets our waiver criteria, which is returning naturally occurring material to the ocean shore. But with Eric's help, we've been able to quickly kind of turn those around. But they are very abundant, those number of requests. So we have a lot of things that while the public only is reviewing kind of a number of these more major alterations, we have a number of minor alterations that don't ever make it to the public review process.
And just to put that in perspective too, and the value of like Eric's position, 2 years ago, we were doing kind of these batch permits for these remedial grading. And once Eric came on and started actually talking to the counties and really coordinating the effort, it went from, I think we issued 3 or 4 remedial grading to 60 within 9 months or something of that nature, because we actually started finding out that they were happening. So moral of the story on that is there was a lot more going on the ocean shore than our department was aware of. And I think that's what we're really trying to get across on this is with that increase in the capacity on the ocean shore and having this team, we are starting to look at these things, whether it's enforcement and compliance, whether it's the permitting, and really actually trying to get a grasp of what's actually going on there. We're just now touching the tip of the iceberg on some of these things. And it seems like every time we kind of go and poke around something, it's like, oh, wow, there's a whole bunch of this going on too. How do we deal with that? How do we bring them around? Whether it's mowing, they were never talking to us. Some of these remedial grading permits, never talking to us. And some of these, like the remedial grading, one of the areas happens to be in an area where Western Snowy Plovers have moved into. Well, previously, without talking to us, those landowners weren't taking that into consideration at all. And so now we've been working with them to basically say, look, you can't go out on the flat sands during the breeding season because we have an obligation to protect these resources. And that was something that was not in consideration for. So there is a lot out there. And this capacity that we've had between the 10 beach rangers and the 3 permitting staff have been able to really look at this, and then having like the blessing of having a Sea Grant fellow to look at our permit files and start actually helping us go through those and figuring out some of the compliance. It's been really great this last couple of years to start seeing the scope that's out there and kind of the hill that we need to climb.
I have a question about the permit applications. You mentioned that the public has a response, like an opportunity to look at them and comment. I'm wondering how the public knows, or did I misunderstand? Okay, so I'm wondering how the public would know that there is like a permit application in that they could review. And then also if the public does like does the public actually review them, or is it kind of a once in a blue moon type of thing?
Right, yeah, so our applications are posted on our Ocean Shore Permits page. You can also sign up to be on our interested parties list. So that way, anytime a application is posted online during that 30-day public review period, you get notified. I believe it's by county. Yes. Yeah, it's by county. Okay. Or you can do it for all counties. Yeah. So you kind of select the areas you're interested in being notified. And then you're notified when those go online. The other thing we ask for in the application is for you to give us the adjacent landowners. So we also notify the adjacent landowners via mail. So that's one other thing. So if you're kind of the bookends of the project, you get the notification. And then if you check online, you get the notification.
Also physically posted. You can see it from the ocean shore if you're a recreating public.
Oh, okay.
Basically put signs out there that say 30-day public hearing, this is what's proposed. You can see it from the beach.
Do people take advantage of that and comment, or?
Yes, it depends on the project. We've had some projects, we haven't seen a single public comment come in, and we've had others, I think, how many did you get on this last one? 30?
Between that and the hearing, yeah, it's at least probably 30.
So yes, it depends on the location, depends on the project. We have had a couple of projects that have ended up going to hearing. If we get requests by 10 or more members of the public for a hearing, we can hold a hearing. That happened once. And then also on the department's initiative, we can hold a hearing, and we've done that once in the last couple of years. So those have generated additional interest from the public. And we get comments both in support and in opposition to them.
Yeah, thank you.
You want to tell them DOB?
No, that was my notes for, okay, I built this before. All right.
So you guys,
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go for it.
so I think you're doing exactly the right thing. But I keep going back in my mind this is happening from every agency, and people are getting overwhelmed with the regulation. And it's just regulatory creep. It's appropriate and necessary, and I have no solutions. And I hate this example, but I will tell you, this is exactly why the movement of move the Idaho border. It's this regulatory creep. And I don't know what we do, because it's the right thing to do.
Chair Hill and Commission and Director Assumption, if I could add a comment before we switch to workshop 3, I just wanted to add something that, first of all, you guys are doing a great job, by the way. This is excellent. Just something that kind of ties some thoughts together that I heard in here, like to Commissioner Krubin's question earlier about whether we could just deny more permits or whatever. I'll say that we are saying no more often, but we're trying to do it in a way where the person can come back around and adjust their proposal and their project to become a yes. And that's one of the reasons that we're here, is to talk about something that Director Assumption and Kevin were talking about just a few minutes ago that made me want to highlight that what we're talking about is we're trying to be a catalyst to changing culture right now. The beach bill has been around for 57 years. And I think people that were standing on the beach then might be a bit taken aback by what they would see today. And we're not trying to change the law. We're trying to right the course of the ship, if you will. And I'll say, not to throw a guy under the bus, but when he was my predecessor in this position, and he started that movement before I got here. And the way the whole team has been looking at this is a way of trying to get people who are out there, because there are, first of all, I should have started with an apology. I used the word entitled this morning, and maybe it came across negatively to talk about landowners on the beach. There are a lot of good landowners. They have a lot of good lawyers. There's good contractors. There's good geotechnicians. There's good archaeologists out there that are part of who we interact with every day. But there is kind of a culture of that the beach is the easy button. It's the back alley or the vacant lot where you can dump your stuff. I wanted to cryptically cite a recent example. The scenario that was up there in number 2, very similar to that Tyler's like the tip of the spear on these things, and he can really like help people see the light of the day. But there's a proposal very similar to that, where the landowner had very easy access to do construction from their property upland without impacting neighbors, driving down a mile of beach, staging on the beach, all these impacts, because to them, it was the easy button. If they don't see it, it doesn't drive over their rhododendrons or whatever on their property. And there just seems to be this kind of culture or mindset about, oh, the beach will fix it. It'll rake it out. It'll smooth it out. It'll all be fine. So we're not talking about changing things to be more bureaucratic or to be more obstructionist, but you might hear some of those kind of comments because we have been just ratcheting down for the last couple of years, even prior to my watch, trying to get people to come more into alignment and be more enlightened. I'm going to use another example. Tyler recently had to help educate some people who had existing armored structures that are in a cultural resource area. At the time of the original construction, that wasn't known. It is today. So I'll just say they came down on him pretty hard that he was getting in the way of their project to try to repair their armored structures. And so he went out of his way to work with our archaeologists and SHPO and kind of, I would say, well out of the realm of what he was responsible to do, to try to educate these people and get them to come around to realize the responsibility that comes with, oh, repair has just as much impact to access to the beach, noise to the neighbors, all of that as an original construction. So I guess what I'm getting at is if you hear us in here in the near future advocating for maintaining our staff at the current level or even trying to expand it, or why we want to do rulemaking, it's not to turn things upside down, it's to come more in alignment with what the purpose of the beach bill was, and to so that you'll be proud of us as the stewards of what I view as the one of the crown jewels parks. Consider it the crown jewel park of the agency. And so when you hear us making asks over the near future, whether it's coming here for rulemaking or whatever we're advocating for, that's what we're doing. We're not just trying to create more bureaucracy for people, or breast, by the way. And then also we even just started on Guy's watch. He set up a budget and I continued that budget. So we're consulting with Steve almost weekly so he can keep us out of trouble. As he's helping with the chart, he tells us where the rocks are. Or as we're riding the course of the ship, we can steer around those. And I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it kind of ties together some of the points. I just want to make sure we're not coming across as, oh, these guys are just trying to make things harder on people. So thank you for letting me add that.
I do want to, coming from, not that I own a beach house by any means, but, when you do look at this, it is also, they do own property on the beach. And so as a good neighbor who knows 10 years from now, I'm going to have to put in riprap and do the same sort of thing. There are going to be some agreements here and there. And it's a lot more expensive to dump from over the top going down 75 feet than drive onto the beach and put it on. And so, I think thinking through, and not that you guys don't, I know you do, but, thinking through kind of that owner and the dilemma they're going through, because when I sit here and listen to this whole discussion, I think, yeah, this is climate change. These storms are getting worse and worse. We're going to see more of this happening. There's no right answer. At the end of the day,
They're built.
stuff is built.
It's ours now.
What happens in the long run? And it's a tough dilemma with no right answer. And, trying to find ways to ease the public burden, but also the homeowner's burden too, in terms of the long-term financial costs that they're gonna end up eating, I think needs to really be taken into consideration as we go into a rulemaking on something around this too. And better education. I mean, do we have a map on, you know, what the future of erosion looks like along the Oregon coast? Are those things that are being shared with the counties as they issue permits in the cities? You know, I know that there's so many folks involved when it comes to purchasing land and building a home. But there's a lot more that we can do too in terms of making sure resources are available to educate about what is being harmed and what the future of the ocean shore may look like in the next 50 years to get thinking about where houses go and where structures go and long-term plans.
And Chair Hill, I appreciate that perspective. There are some states that are actually moving away from even allowing shoreline armoring, period. So again, I think we're looking at this more from a balance, but you know, I've heard several different states that have recently changed their policies, primarily even looking toward these kind of unforeseen, unpredictable future with the sea level rise and storms, and they've moved away from actually the use of armoring. There's a lot of science that I'm not really, you know, aware of on why those decisions were made, but that is happening. And to where even like some of the policies they only allow armoring for infill where there's already armor, those types of things. And again, those are some of the dialogues we're going to need to be having as a state. And this extends beyond just the ocean shore. As I mentioned before, this is a DLCD and local planning discussion. There are work groups that are looking at being developed. We've had work groups in the past, but there is OSU sits on, it's called the COPES. I forget what it stands for now, but it's related to Cascadia, but they're looking at not just Cascadia events, it's coastal erosion as well as tsunami and those other types of coastal hazards. So there is an active group that's out looking and doing a lot of the research. And some of those partners are looking at things like the coastal erosion rates and predictions. OSU is working on some modeling. It's still not ready to go on the ground yet, but I think as I understand it, they're looking forward to being able to have some relatively, good prediction models that can be used a lot more proactively with land managers, because there are, between the variances of sea level rise, because it's different up and down the coast, and the rate at which it's going to, and the rate and height is different up and down the coast. The type of erosion that's expected is different where you're out on the coast. And there's a lot of those variabilities that can't be captured with a single brush. And so being able to get some of those tools on board is very important to actually start that communication. And one of the things that I'll be referencing in this next session is the 1993, a report from 1993. Well, a follow-up to that was actually recommendations from a coastal hazards policy work group that had things like landowner education, like during the land purchase process, those type of things. And some of those things just never really moved forward or have been tried and failed in the past. And so again, I think that's where, as a collective, as we move through our rulemaking in that little portion of the world we control, we need to also be looking at how do we, as an agency, speak to our partner agencies that are out there to say, hey, we're doing this. How do we work together to move forward with this discussion? Because we only control that interface. Like, as I said before, where the rubber meets the road, but we don't control the wheel. The wheel is the county, the wheel is DLCD. We're just kind of saying that because there's a lot of upland choices and decisions that need to be made too. And so, yeah, it's a very complex issue. What we're looking at doing is trying to, how do we narrow our field down so we can start having, instead of being reactive to some of the photos you've seen and spending our time educating a contractor on how to drive their equipment safely, how can we use that time to partner and find these other things out and work on that side? And so again, it's that, as I mentioned all day, I think it's been our mantra, it's the balance, right? Because you're absolutely right. We have both sides of that coin to be looking at.
So in the interest of not reinventing the wheel, a light bulb just came on with something that was said here. Have you looked at what's the rulemaking that I think DSL would have done on fill and removal on stream bank erosion? The issue is very similar to the same. And are there opportunities for us to be smarter in our decision making based on what they've already done?
So thank you, Commissioner Grassley. So I was actually involved, I worked at DSL and I was involved with that rulemaking when DSL rules were basically completely overhauled, which is kind of what we're working on here. Very similar undertaking. As I'm kind of preparing some of the concept rules, I'm actually using a lot of what DSL has put together for a couple different reasons. One is where it's the same, it's easy to just copy and paste because it's already been, they've had it now. That was 2002, 3, somewhere in there. I think we were started on that. So they've had 20 years to continue to clean it up since I was involved in it. Is if it applies, great. And we are looking at mirroring that, and other pieces have been acting as kind of a template, and then we're adjusting it for the ocean shore. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is just having that nice consistent source, but the other is when it comes to estuaries, you can actually have a DSL permit and an ocean shore permit, depending on where you're at in that estuary. So having some rule structure that's similar can also help applicants in that point in time. Or when you go from the extreme low out, you're on DSL as well. So again, in those two interfaces, having some similar language can actually help the applicant by using some similar terms. But the underlying statutes are different, so the rule language will ultimately be different.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Chair Hill, did you want to take a break before we go into 3 or?
Let's power through. And if
All
we
right,
need to
power
stand
through.
up, go to the bathroom, please do so.
Great. So this last one, it should actually help.
Yeah, if you need a break.
I'm good. I am good.
Okay.
I'd rather power through it too. So this last one, I think it's actually going to take a lot of this dialogue and move it back up. I've mentioned the 1993 report. I'm going to kind of give the caveat that I set out in the field this morning on this. I use the 1993 report because it's the last time we've actually anybody's looked at the programs kind of along our coast in really a systematic way. There's been some other efforts along the way where in 2015, there was a look at how much armoring was on the coast. There was some other pieces that have come along, but this was a full evaluation. And so kind of the caveat on it is I tried to fill in the blanks with some data that we know today, but really what we need to do is something similar to that again as a state so that we can look back and reflect over the last 30 years. Because what you'll hear me say a lot in this is that when I saw this report for the first time, I'd been on with the department for about a year and a half. And I went, this is everything that I've been thinking for the last year and a half. And as I started looking into it, at least as it relates to OPRD's recommendations that came out of that, we really never implemented any of those. And a lot of that was, as Director Assumption mentioned, we had one staff person. It is almost impossible to do even the basic permit load with one person, let alone actually looking at rulemaking and other things. So there's a reason for it. It's just we're sitting here 30 years later looking at the same thing. So I guess I want to bring that up is that the numbers I'm giving you are to help set context, but I really don't want anybody to come out here and say, that's an exact number. Because what I did is I tried to grab from what available information I have and say, here is a marker that we can at least kind of look at as a target. It might be 10% more, 10% less. It might be a little different, but I just want to set that up that this is not a detailed, thorough assessment unless it came out of the 93 report. So I just want to make sure I set that up. And that's kind of a foundation. And I use that all the way through even as kind of the guiding thread through these 4 topics that we're going to be looking at, which is really, where did we come from? What have we been doing over the last 50 plus years? And then kind of where do we go from here? So again, just going back, as I kind of mentioned briefly this morning, the Oregon's coast has been pretty important. I actually had a second slide of this that I kind of wish I'd have put back in now, but even from statehood, but there have been different things throughout Oregon's history that have dealt with the coast and the shoreline. Really where the first kind of significant piece related to the beach bill was in 1913. And that was when the wet sands were basically dedicated as a state highway. There was a prior effort where it was just the wet sands in Clatsop County, and then it was expanded coastwide. That was kind of the first piece. Well, then in 1966, some of you may, and I've got a picture of it in the next slide. Some of you may have heard of Surf Sand Motel in Cannon Beach. Basically, they put up driftwood, they put up little cabana type shelters, and they put signs on that said private beach. And that led to a whole campaign that resulted in the beach bill in 67, which was kind of a, I'll say a stopgap without getting into all the details. And then the pieces that were a little bit of question mark, things like the statutory vegetation line, and those were further developed in 1969 and really set it out. Two of the kind of the provisions were this kind of beach zone and these public prescriptive right, where it was, you know, there's a control from the statutory vegetation line seaward. But between 1969 and when DSL got some of their rules, there was a gap, a regulatory gap. And until 1999 with Senate Bill 11, there was actually a gap between the programs, and you could actually put in some armor without a state permit needed, and do other alterations on the ocean shore as we know it today without a permit. So in 1999, the DSL program was brought under, and it became the entire state recreation areas I've described it earlier. And so really what that allowed the department to do, or the state to do, is to have one voice for the wet and the dry sands of the ocean shore. 1999 was the last time we did rulemaking, and it was to implement that bill. There are some pieces in that didn't necessarily mesh perfectly that were never corrected after that point in time. And so we're still looking at those today going, I can see why they put it in there, but why didn't they ever fix it, right? And it's that part of rules are supposed to be developmental over time. So in reality, sometime prior to 99 is when the last time our rules were looked at. I haven't gone back and really dug into when any sort of significant rulemaking was, but we at least know it was pre-99. Because the 1999 stuff was primarily for that Senate Bill 11. So really, this graphic here, well, the picture here is when that's at Surf Sands. That's kind of one of the iconic pictures that was in the Oregonian and every place, kind of defining that beach bill and that private stretch of beach. This came out of a 1969 report from the House Majority Leader, just kind of showing this is what their concept was for the ocean shore. And I think I put it in here because I have my fancy graphs at the beginning, but I love the simplicity, right? You have the private property under public use and the public beach. It can't be any simpler than that, right? And that really defines kind of even how we look at it today. And so I think it's just a great reflection of what we've talked about today and bringing it back. So one of the things that kind of came about, beach bill came in. There was to protect the ocean shore, treat as a state recreation area. The effective date of the Goal 18 is in 1977. And as we mentioned out on the beaches, it basically sets up that if the lot had development prior to 1977, then they can be eligible. Somewhat of a grandfathering. Well, development included even undeveloped lots, as long as they were physically improved with streets, utilities, and some things like that. Again, I'm not going to go into the details fully on that, but it did include lots that didn't actually have structures on them. Well, what happened was you ended up getting kind of what could be a mosaic of eligible and ineligible properties as the coastline was developed. As you can see here, red properties are ineligible for shoreline armoring, green are eligible. And this happens to be that Lincoln Beach area. And if you notice, majority of it's green with some few red inclusions. A lot of these red inclusions have now gone through goal exceptions and are actually eligible at this time. We've got our park sitting in there that is not eligible currently. But you can see you have large stretches of beach. Well, this happens to be the Siletz cell, which I'm going to use that 1993 report was based on. It's part of why I threw it in here is to show how we get to that scenario of what's presented in there is it is a majority of green. And that's reflected, if you look on this left-hand table, this is a chart put together by DLCD. I'm sure these numbers have changed, a little bit outdated. But you can, for reference, you can see Lincoln County has the majority of tax lots adjacent to the ocean shore. About 900 of them were developed pre-77. 250 were then brought through exception. That number is probably closer to 270 now, just based on when I know when this chart was developed. And 500 were not eligible. So, you know, again, a majority of the properties in Lincoln County are actually eligible, or private properties are eligible for armoring. And you can see again, Clatsop, Tillamook, Lane, Douglas, Coos, and Curry. You can see that Lincoln County is really where the epicenter of our workload is, and it's mainly because of this. There are more eligible lots in Lincoln County than there are the entire rest of the coast.
Go back, what's yellow?
Yellow is they got an exception. So they went, basically what you do is you go to the county and you say, I'm gonna ask you to make my property
Might as well be green.
eligible and make it green because of these reasons and the county rules on it.
Might as well be
It says-
green. That's.
So it is green, absolutely. So what does that translate to? And, I'm gonna point out, so you'll see these little gray insets here. I'm not necessarily gonna read all of them. I might read portions of them, but these are quotes directly out of that 93 report. And I think there's some really telling statements. As I said, this was really kind of a thorough review of not just OPRD, but of the state's implementation. But out of that report, they looked at every year and said effectively 50% of that littoral cell had been subject to shoreline protection structures. Doing some kind of digging around a couple other reports, it appears we're very close to 80% right now of that littoral cell. Again, more information is needed to have a definitive on that, but everybody seems to kind of agree on that. So over that time period from 67, we had, when the beach bill went into place, we had about 15% of that littoral cell had armoring on it. And today we have 80%.
80% has armoring on it
Yes.
now.
Yes.
And what,
That is
where, I can't read, where does the littoral cell start and where does it end?
So this one comes from, the definition on this one was from from Fishing Rock to I think it was Cascade Head. Was it Cascade Head? Okay. For this report. So basically you've got Lincoln Beach, Glen Eden, and Lincoln City for the most part in that.
And Land's End.
Land's End, yes.
I mean, Road's End.
Yeah,
Road's End.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
We're
Yeah,
done.
sorry, I kind of included that in Lincoln City, but yes, that's true. And so, and as you can see from the quote here, the county basically said, yeah, this is all buildable. It's not, so people have gone in and developed. And, you know, I think somebody brought it up before, but this quote back here, it's that with regard to the hazards of adjacent beach resources. Again, landowners were basically said, yes, go ahead and develop. So now that they've developed, and you'll see this in some of the other statements, well, you've developed, but you're in a hazard area, which has then subsequently led to, we now need to armor because our house is going to fall in. And you'll see that, what I mean by those hazard areas, this is in 1972. Note this section of shoreline here. They had a major erosion event in 72, actually led to the loss of several homes on this stretch of beach. If you notice number one, that house had armor around it. It survived. This is number one. There are now homes right here.
Wow, right there, right before.
So these homes were built on what was beach after that event. This happens to be house number one as well from the beach this year. And so when it comes back to that, you know, that statement on the previous slide about without regard to the hazard, this is kind of what they're talking about is you had stuff that literally eroded and then was built on. Well, there isn't a lot. What they did was they came in and they filled in, they backfilled. We don't know if they took it from the beach, if they brought in sand. We don't really know where the material came from, but it was backfilled. This is kind of before, after.
Yeah.
And this is what it looks like, this site looks like today. It happens to be one of the sections that's not actually armored. But they came in, backfilled it, and then put the houses on it. Well, there's not a lot in between the house and the beach, so once that erodes, they come into us and ask for armoring. So again, it goes back to that bigger question of, at what point in time was that decision made? And does, if the beach bill was there in 67, homes weren't there in 72, but then we're later, where does that go? And again, that's some of the big questions that get brought up in this report, because our beaches do change over time. And one of the things that we routinely deal with is talking, especially to landowners, is they see it as static. I bought my house, it looked like this year it eroded. That can't happen. I don't want to see any loss of land. And so what we tend to see is a request for armoring as soon as there's any erosion, not necessarily when there's a threat to the property. And that came out of the report as well, and we see it where there's armor that's hundreds of feet west of the home. Well, where is that risk at, right? Where is that need, as Tyler talked about? But just kind of going through the slides here, this happens to be one snapshot of an area. You'll notice the red line here is the statutory vegetation line.
Where?
What is that?
Where is?
This is I'm trying not to give specific locations, but this is still in that Lincoln Beach area. This is still in this littoral cell that we were talking about. So in the Lincoln Beach area. You'll notice there was a foredune that came out about to where the statutory vegetation line is. And so this is, almost 30 years after the beach bill, or 40 years, sorry, can't do math. There is the foredune still pretty much at that line. It's actually west of that line now, right? And then it erodes back. So this changes, and you notice the width of the beach changes, right? Every single one of these, and that is very common along the stretch of our beach. They'll narrow and widen, as we talked about, as sand's coming from those offshore deposits moving on. Is it moving south or north than that littoral cell? There's a lot of changes that happen, but you'll notice the beach width is different in all of these. And then in 2019, you can see that dune's still there. Unfortunately, I don't have a series after. But in 2019, there was a storm event that ended up with a lot of rip cells that develop, rip embayments, that ended up eroding this back to the line, basically the vegetation line you can see here. So you can see that it moved back probably about, in some cases, 50 to 80 feet from where this kind of foredune used to sit. This was a during construction photo, but that line back here where you can see that solid vegetation line is where it eroded back to. And then you take in 2024, and that red line is here, and this is all rock. And the surf is up.
Wow.
I don't want to say too much about the surf because it was also time of year where it was taken. It could have been during a king tide versus these were in low tides, but it does give the perception of how these things change. And now there's armor up to that red line. And so again, it's this is how things change and how quick they change. And then there's decisions made. And some of the decisions may be based on a long-term trend of erosion. Some may be based on a one-time event hit. And again, that's where, as you'll see through some of the report quotes in here, we just need to improve how we're screening for that.
How is that rock? So did all the homeowners come together and agree to ask for a permit to do
Yes.
that?
Yeah, and it's a lot deeper than that, but the short answer is yes.
Kevin, you don't know that the tides are at the same stage here. Is that what you?
That is
just said?
correct. That's why I was saying that. I want to just show that things do change day to day to year to year, but this is not necessarily an indication that beach is narrow. Now, generally speaking, I think we're seeing even over the last couple of years that the surf in this area is interacting with that rock wall more than it would have, previously. So there probably has been some narrowing, but again, no, that has not been researched and looked at. Yeah, go.
I'll throw Chris under the bus since he threw Guy. Yeah, so at this location, winter of 2024, me and Chris visited this site after this shoreline protective structure was permitted and constructed. And it has caused an immediate shortening of the beach where now at mid-tide, even folks, north-south access is completely severed, where folks are traveling north, then they get to where this structure is built, and they actually cannot continue down the beach even at mid tide, and they actually have to turn around. So they actually cannot travel down the beach even at mid tide. That's not just a high tide. So even in this short amount of time that you see here, the chronology here, there is an immediate effect when these property owners kind of band together and build these structures. The compounding impacts are noticed almost immediately.
So out of that report, one of the things they looked at, and I mentioned this on the beach, what this states down here is the average revetment size for the cell contrasted. So the average is up here, contrasted with one that was sized for a maximum wave run up during a 100-year storm event, extreme high tide. This is the bottom one, which was, again, this was done through OSU, they had engineers on this that looked at that 10 by 15 foot. And we do see some structures out in that area that are still that size. But what they said is, this is what you're seeing for the average out there. So it was actually almost twice as big. It was a 16 by 27. What we're seeing now proposed is a 30 by 60. So I actually created this one to make it look the same, but it's a 30 foot by 60 foot is what this kind of the standard average design is right now. So you can see there's a significant change. These structures are getting bigger and bigger. Is that because of, as we mentioned earlier, we want to have more of a somewhat permanent structure, or is it because the storm events are actually more intense? Again, needs a qualified professional to look at that and really have that kind of evaluative look. But the result is you have the old, this is one of the older, I don't know if it's the 16 by 27 or 10 by 15, but an older, smaller revetment that's been effectively working to this much larger angular slope that extends further onto the beach, which, as Tyler mentioned before, we noted, we call that encroachment, right? It's encroaching onto the ocean shore. And I really want to point out this quote up on top, because this goes back to, I think, a question that was brought up. I don't remember who brought it up previously, but really it's that the designs are not critically reviewed, and in most cases are many times larger than needed, resulting in unexpected beach encroachments. And at least personally, that's something that we seem to be seeing as we ask these questions about why is it so big? Is there an alternative that's smaller or a different design that has less impacts? And it seems to be, we get kind of responses that are, it needs to be this big. Well, does it really? Back looking at the history, this is apparently what was needed, and that was what was built. So the same question is out there again, why we need to be working with our partners. Part of that reasoning is, if you look back in, as I said, we're almost at 50% of the littoral saw with armor on it. They were showing that there had been about 5 acres of beach encroachment. Well, when you go from that and you start increasing that to a 60-foot width, how much more encroachment is it? How many more acres of that from kind of that 1993 report have been lost or encroached upon and now covered with rock? There's some of those bigger questions. Because when you look at the table down here, what it's showing is the distance, the shore protection structures extended west of this beach zone, which is all the statutory vegetation line. And you notice there were some that went over 40s. There was 9 that went 31 to 40. And again, a lot of them were 0 to 10. So they were right at that line. But we're now seeing more that are probably out in this range, a higher percentage of them. So again, it's just something that we need to be looking at and evaluate what has actually changed out there, because it has a big impact on this kind of cumulative impacts. And at least by the nonprofits that are out there, the NGOs that are advocating for the ocean shore, they're very concerned about cumulative impacts and approach us with that. As Tyler showed you this graphic before, this is an observed situation around the world. And once you have it to this point to where there is no beach run up, you have the full impact of the waves. And then it's even more expensive to maintain those, because you're actually would then be working in the surf, and it's gonna be more complicated because you're actually working in Corps of Engineers, DSL. I mean, there's potentially other regulatory agencies that come involved too. But when you look back in 93, the summary was that 39% of the annual sand supply was locked up. Well, if we've almost doubled the amount of armoring since then, does that mean we've almost doubled that again, there's question marks that are out there. Like I said, I don't have the answer today, but we know it's more. So how much does that mean that we're moving toward this lower, and how fast does that mean we're moving toward this outcome? Because we do have situations like this. This happens to be up in the Rockaway area, and it was some structures that were built way out. They put armor around it and is now effectively a peninsula. You can see the normal shoreline is here, and it sticks quite a bit out. Aerial imagery, whatnot, shows it very clearly how far that sticks out. It is a unique case. But this kind of is a reminder of that's what we get when we armor too, is then we have this impact to the public use. And these structures then become subject to potentially flanking or even being islanded as erosion may move around them. So when we look at cumulative impacts, there's these two highlighted sections here. I'm gonna read those out, but if you can multitask, please kind of try to read along on the rest of this, because I think it's a long, but I think valuable quote, but it's really looking at that the long-term cumulative impacts really are probably the most serious concerns from 93. And as I said, we've armored a lot more since then. And as we've been talking about all day, it may eventually lead to the beaches that are narrower and less effective as erosion buffers. And I think that's the point I want to put across, is that I mentioned it out on site. Wider beaches help prevent erosion. Once you narrow the beach, you have more wave energy directly impacting the shoreline. And then it becomes a feedback of how much bigger do the structures need to be, what needs to happen on that, and how much public use is there. So again, it's this broader dialogue that needs to happen, because while the landowner may be protecting their property today, the question is, under some of the models, what might that look like is if you put a wall up there and you have no beach, and now the full force of winter storms is coming in, is that breaking up and actually landing in your house? And we've had at least one house since I've been here where they've had windows broken out because the waves have come up and over revetments in this area where the beach is narrowed. It basically washed up the revetment and threw it into the living room of the house. It's there. The ocean has a lot of energy. So again, I can't say that I have all the answers. I just want to point the stuff out and make sure you're aware of kind of what the literature is saying and what some of the things that have evaluated our Oregon coast has. Again, looking at that report, I think I talked to a couple of you out there. This is one of those comments that I think really exemplifies part of why we're coming and talking to you and why we need to have this more critical look at how we're doing things as a department. Because as a state, even in 93, it was that revetments and seawalls have become the norm. That's the same thing we're seeing today. There isn't a lot that we can tell of consideration being given to some of these other alternatives. It is, we have erosion, we want a revetment. That's the end of the dialogue that's being brought to us. And so it's up to us to help educate and inform. But the issue happens then, as noted in here. So once you put in one revetment, now the neighbors to the north and south want them. Now they need them because there's increased erosion from what's called end effect, or which is basically, as we talked about out there, where there's an increased erosion north and south. And so this last statement of revetments beget revetments, that's what we see is, well, one person, well, we just need to put a whole wall in here and then it'll be okay. Because if we only have one, then it'll get flanked, or or the neighbor will be affected. And so again, it becomes once you do one, it snowballs. And that's the question that we'll have to have a dialogue on, because we have areas of the coast that are not fully armored. You saw kind of an example of, as I mentioned earlier, it's the worst case scenario that's out there. The question is, what about these other areas? Before they get to that, we should be at least able to have that discussion and be able to know what we're going to do and how we're going to approach that. Because over time, we've issued 800 shoreline protection permits. On that graph or that table earlier with the goal 18 eligible properties, there's roughly 1,850 eligible properties. So that means currently, if there's a 1-to-1 ratio, and again, I'm not going to say that lays out exactly, we could be around 40% roughly of the eligible properties having armor. Well, that means 60% are not currently armored. So what's the discussion we have about that other 60%? And really that comes down to, how we want to look at ourselves and how we've been implementing it as a state. And that's compliance, kind of looking back, and I'm using this slide's really more about program compliance. And looking at some of these quotes in here raises some red flags of like, well, maybe we need to look at why that is. When you have statements like, this happened to be in one of the exception process of 42 of 57 ineligible properties already have a protective structure. Is that because they were given an exception? Is it because they have an unlawful, revetment? Is it because they met in they were the 30% of structures built prior to 67? Again, we need to have more research to figure out why is that? What is the underlying output? But to have ineligible properties in that high a percentage already having some sort of shoreline protective structure raises a question of why. And then things like the policies giving preference to hazard avoidance and non-structural means, but yet in practice, as we mentioned, seawalls and revetments have become the preferred strategy. So yeah, there's a lot of these statements here that kind of bring up that we need to look internally. We need to look at, kind of how we're operating and why, and what do we want to do. The other part is looking at the projects themselves. Because even though we've issued a permit, is what we see on the ground really what's supposed to be there? Well, in 93, they found that 8% of the shoreline protection projects had a violation, right? We did a pilot project this year. We're starting kind of looking at overall program compliance, and we looked at one stretch of beach. And it was very interesting. What we kind of started seeing was that so sometimes shoreline protection structures are actually covered with sand naturally, so we can't see them and we don't know what they're. So when we looked at them, that's what the observable armor is. The lots that had observable armor, over half of them had some sort of non-compliance issue with them. But half of those, so 25% of the projects out there on the ground, were actually built larger or different than what we had permitted. And so again, there's a question mark of where we need to figure out how to, through our policies and practices, help educate the landowners, educate the contractors to do what they're the right thing when they apply, but then also to follow through with what they apply and then hold them accountable on the back end. Because really what it comes down to from this 93 report, and this blue area is probably the most important, was, they found that the outcomes in that specific littoral cell were inconsistent with the policy goals. So we have kind of a question is, do we bring the programs back in compliance with the policy goals, or do we change the policy goals, right? That's really the only ways that you come into that. And so again, we just need to have those discussions, and those are some of the things we're bringing up during rulemaking and some of the things that'll be brought before you as a commission. And then I think this quote down here is probably, again, reiterating what we said before, but it really comes down to the practice that really the rights of the private upland owners to protect their property using the strongest, most secure method possible. The seawall revetment has primacy over public rights. That is the struggle that Tyler and I have been having to have a discussion with the applicants, is, again, going back to the balance, but this is how they approach us, saying, we want a wall, we have to protect our structure or our property, you have to give it to us. And that is really, in pretty blunt terms, how that's been approached by some of the people we've worked with. So again, really just looking at that and trying to set those expectations up as we move forward. So with all that wonderful news, what does that mean, right? Where do we go? Well, with climate change, sea level rise, increasing storm frequency and duration, intensities, we're going to be looking as an agency and with our partners of needing to protect public access. We're seeing a lot of things like scarps forming at the end of beach access trails. We're seeing the need to put in things like debris bollards at public access points to prevent wood from being thrown up on stairways that never had wood thrown up on them. And just erosion like we saw today at several of those sites. We're going to be confronted with kind of this dilemma of, do you deal with the house falling into the ocean, or do you deal with no beach? Which of those is it? I mean, it's really an either or almost to some extent in some places. And so we're on the ocean shore, because we don't deal with the upland, we're dealt with kind of the results of that. What are our options? And how do we move forward with that? landslides, as I mentioned, ODOT's approaching us about looking at ocean shore alterations, in particular armor. This site here was a slide from last year. We already authorized an emergency project, emergency permit to put rock in here. So they've now got armor, at least in this, what is it, 60-foot? This was a 60-foot wide slide, so they put armor in that stretch. This whole area. What's that?
Red Tier Del Mar.
No, this is down in Gold Beach area. And this whole area is a susceptible area. So our question is, okay, now that we put rock in here, what's going to happen here? And eventually, is this whole area going to be armor, right? And those are the questions we're discussing with ODOT. This area happens to be not too far from where we were today. This was a large landslide. The home up here actually got moved back. I think one of the other homes over here got moved. There is at least one house still sitting there that is perched very precariously, with not much land up, but there is now a wall at the toe of that landslide. And then we also, as I mentioned, compliance. We need to look forward. We need to maintain having our 10 beach rangers and our staff like Eric. We get fun stuff like this built. And if we're not out looking at it and finding these things, people are climbing out or falling in its debris on the beach, and it becomes both pollution and a public safety issue. Sandbags. This happened to be a very nicely built, hand-built wall that was unlawfully built. We're working right now to have that be removed. They're hopefully in the next week or two, it'll be starting to get removed. And then we also need to look at, as I said before, we need to look at the program going forward, look at some additional research, start looking at where we've issued permits, what we've done on the ocean shore, and looking at overall what's out there. And as I mentioned previously, having Kristen on board with us, we have gone through and was it almost 1,800 files, I believe it was, have been, with Kristen's help and with some help we had over the last 2 years, have been digitized. We've now got them in our GIS system. We're working on cleaning up the data, but it's the first time they've all been in one place. And we can actually find what's going on. And so now we're looking forward to starting to actually look through those files and figure out what is the story telling us from the past. So again, just really looking inward as well, because we do have all these resources out here. We're the stewards for them. And how do we protect them for future generations? Because we've already got sea level rise. We've already got storm intensity. We've already got increased public use. Shoreline alterations is one more threat to them. How do we manage that and make it to where it's, again, balanced in the protection of these resources? Because there are a lot of things up and down this coastline. Same thing with our recreation use and figuring out that balance. Because really, none of us know what the future looks like. These pictures are in the 1920s. This is a bare sand spit. It is loose sand. That is a natural condition. This is loose sand. That's its natural condition. You look at them now, this is a subdivision. There's also a lot of invasive non-native beach grasses that have taken over our shorelines. I can pretty much guarantee you that nobody that was alive when they saw this knew that it would look like this. Just as though almost 100 years from now, we don't know what this is going to look like. This happens to be Nehalem Bay State Park. It's now shore pine, beach grass, campgrounds. It was bare open sand. Again, who knew that was going to be? At one point in time, that was going to be part of Highway 101. So again, we don't know what the future looks like. So that's really the challenge that we're going to have, is what can we do with what we know today, but looking forward and setting the future up for success. Because really it comes down to this. Do we want open beaches, or do we want to have houses with pretty views and no beaches? I mean, that's an extreme side of things, but really that's kind of the question that we have in front of us. And we may be at this scenario under sea level rise, not in some, and under some areas of the coast, regardless of what we do. And that's where we need to be having this open discussion. Because as we saw out there today, this is the seawall we saw today. We've got other places, Eco Block, armoring, other seawalls. And this is that photo I was talking about. This is a panoramic of one stretch of beach where it is as far as you can see. This is one of those 30 by 60 foot revetments, as far as you can see. Most of the public's not seeing this, but it's out there. So how do we take what we've learned out of that report and move it forward? And really what we're looking at, as Chris mentioned earlier, we're not looking at changing the law. We're looking at trying to go back and make it fit into the statute. So out of this report, some of the recommendations came in was, again, hazard avoidance, minimize the adverse effects, and then compensate for unavoidable impacts, right? And then the other is clarifying the policies that relate to evaluating these projects and going through the permit application process. So these two really are what, set us up for the rulemaking that we want to undertake over the next couple of years. We're starting to do some internal work. We're looking at potentially doing some kind of town hall type meetings to gather some feedback from the public to help inform where we go before we move into the actual rulemaking process. But really emphasizing that beach protection and improving our application forms, our guidance by reinforcing those beach bill standards that were out there, and also continue to work with our partners. So really this is kind of one of those pieces that directly ties to OPRD. We also there were several other recommendations that relate to our partner agencies. I don't have those on here because we don't have control over that. The other part was looking, as I mentioned, out on the beach littoral cell planning. We did as an agency, we pursued a grant last year, weren't successful. So it is on our mind to look at this. We're also looking at, hopefully in the near future, looking at updating our ocean shore management plan. Laurel and I have been discussing, like, how do we at least take some of these littoral cell planning concepts and maybe incorporate them in the ocean shore management plan. The last time the plan was updated was 2005, so it's desperately in need. But by looking maybe more at this littoral cell plan, we might be able to actually use some of the data that Chair Hill mentioned, like looking forward at what the erosion predictions are or these other things, what resources are in those cells, and actually saying, here's what's okay to do, here's what's not okay to do, here's what we expect this area to look like in the future. And at least for our stretch of the beach, we can dictate that. And then we can use that to inform our local planning partners of, this is what we find important, right? And it helps us have a better seat at the table than the planning departments going through their comprehensive plans and saying, well, we implemented goal 18, that's all we needed to do, without really looking at all the resources and concerns that we have out there. So again, it can help us speak with a little bit more unified voice by informing those local partners. And then the one success story, as I mentioned before, they'd identified that gap in 1999. That gap with DSL and OPRD was filled by us absorbing the DSL program. So we have at least one success. And I think as a program, we're all looking forward to working with you all and our partners to figure out how do we bring some of these other things to fruition and make it a success going forward. And that is that. Lots of information there. I'd love to answer any questions. I know you've heard a lot about the beach today, a lot more than you probably wanted to. And
so listening to this, and you guys have put a ton of work into it, and I think you're going the right way. I think I heard you say that you're going to put together what's going on, what's happened, what we need to do, and go to your local partners. I suggest you back up from that and ask them to come and sit with you. Maybe this is an Oregon Solutions project to pull together those local partners, those government entities. If I count right, you have 7 counties, and I guarantee you the spectrum of what they want to do and are going to do is from both ends. But pull them together and sit down and say, what do we do? Instead of saying, here's the problem and here's what we think you need to do for us. And maybe you'll get more buy-in.
yeah, thank you for that, Commissioner Grassi. So the intent behind that littoral cell planning is a planning effort, right? We are already actually having dialogues with some of the counties. Right now, I'm sitting on a work group with Clatsop County. They're looking at updating their goals 16, 17, and 18 portion of their comprehensive plan. And so we're actually having dialogue about how does that incorporate the ocean shore and how do we use their planning process to help cross that. So we're having that at that point. The portion where I was getting at with the littoral cell planning is you approach that, it's a public process. You work with those partners. And the nice thing about it is you're breaking it down by chunks of the ocean shore. So you can go to that one county, for example, if that littoral cell sits in a county, and you have that discussion about what do we do here and what's important for all of us here versus, as you said, a one-way street. And I apologize if that's how I characterized it, but it's more of, at least in our plan, by us having a plan that says on the ocean shore, this is how we want to manage. It's then something that they also have as a reference, but that doesn't mean they would be excluded from the development of that. In fact, we have to have them engaged because of the way the land use laws work and the way everything overlaps on the ocean shore. It really is, it is a, I'll say it needs to be a symbiotic relationship with our local partners.
So years ago, an old friend of mine, who was a county commissioner, said, when you've seen one county in Oregon, you've seen one county. But by the same token, what I'm suggesting is you get them all around the table at the same time, because they're going to learn from each other. And if you get the buy-in, this is going to simplify the whole process. So,
yeah, and I think that's a great idea. The only thing I would pick back on that is every county has such unique issues, and like some counties have almost no oceanfront development. You know, they have primarily federal lands. You know, look at Douglas County. It's primarily federal land in Douglas County. Coos County, a big chunk of it is federal or state land, and then a lot of it's agricultural land. It's not shoreline development like maybe in Lincoln County, those type of things. So again, they're very unique and different. So that may present its own challenges, but I don't disagree with you. And again, that's part of why we have a good relationship with the LCD and are working with them on a lot of these questions as they come up. And trying to I'm actively working with my counterpart there to say, how do we start opening some of these dialogues and looking forward and using, as I mentioned earlier, some of these other efforts that have happened in other states too, because we're not the first state to have challenges. The East Coast has done it. California's looked at it. The California Coastal Commission, Washington's actively looking at things. And Hawaii is actively looking at things. There are a lot of states that have made it. And that's one of the values of our partners. You know, my coworker DLCD has worked in a lot of these different areas doing this type of stuff and brings a wealth of knowledge. And so again, we're stronger as a collective. We don't, not a single one of us has an answer. And we're also asking our academic partners, how can they also be engaged through, like I mentioned, this COPES group and other efforts that are ongoing, and starting to talk with our partners in Washington and that are dealing with a lot of the same issues and actually wanting to learn from us on some things. And hopefully we can start doing some sharing of information, because we're dealing with a lot of the same issues.
Do we have a coastal commission?
We do not.
We do.
No, maybe we ought to be thinking about getting some sort of a more cogent overall through, I mean, we don't have the staff for this, not even close. So OSU, PSU, I don't even think Oregon Solutions has the, I think we ought to be talking to the Coco Casas about a coastal commission to be looking, because the sand that is leaving Lincoln County is showing up in Tillamook, okay, or it doesn't, and I have one rant. Dennis, stop by my place in Pacific City. I'll show you a 1952 photograph of Bob Sprague. There isn't a blade of grass on it. Now, who planted that grass, Dennis?
Dennis did.
Okay, so just pass the buck right on, because I looked at those photos and I've got that photo of Bob Sprague, not a blade of grass. Okay. Thanks, Dennis. I got that off my, yeah.
And Commissioner.
And it's worse. It gets worse every time a horse poops out there.
And I hear a chair nomination for the Coastal Commission.
I would do that. If you can get it legislatively. if
Oh, I
you
know
can-
somebody who could help.
No, we need to, it needs to be, yeah, it needs to be a commission that looks at the whole coast and says, these are the local problems that all these people need to work with.
Mhm.
And in the meantime, we got to keep doing what we're doing. It's not going to be quick, and there's no quick here.
We had one.
Commissioner,
What, a coastal,
We had a coastal commission.
what happened to it?
It went away at the time of the adoption of the land use program. It
Ah,
went to the statewide planning goals.
ah.
I forget
so
the
we
exact
always
name of
see
it.
them. So let's, I'm willing to talk to legislators, this, by the way.
and Commissioner Berger, on that point, that the 93 report, I didn't have those in there. And then also the subsequent, the 94 recommendations from the interagency hazard work actually had those type of recommendations of kind of an oversight, because as I remember, the context was basically that local decisions can be politically influenced, and you need kind of an oversight to look at that bigger vision. And so there is some, I guess where I'm going on is that is something that anybody decides to move forward with that's outside of where I'm going. There is some background information in some of those reports that could be looked at.
What-
Is where I want to leave that at.
What I'd like is a study group somehow that looks at what other states are doing as far as coastal commissions. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And then we can make decisions as to how much power to give such a commission and how it would work. What we don't need is another metro government. Sorry. But we do need a more overall look. In the meantime, I really appreciate this look, Dennis, and that picture, Dennis.
And Commissioner Berger, also on the beach grass, so it actually there were several things. Parks has been involved with both beach grass, even Scotch broom planting and shore pine planting on different parts of the coast. But it was also ODOT landowners, there was a lot, and then beach grass itself actually migrates fairly readily. So it's
Yeah,
extremely difficult to eradicate, and it moves very readily, so.
with the horse poop.
More than, even just being eroded out,
Shoreline bird.
being eroded out and washing down, I mean, there's a lot of ways that it moves, so.
But
Thought-
Dennis is right there.
Absolutely. No, you got to give Dennis credit. I think Dennis planted the whole coast probably, but. okay.
No. I brought in seeds today.
Wilbur and Dennis.
Other thoughts or comments before?
And these are just hugely important issues. I mean, I really appreciate you guys taking like all day, starting here at 7:30 in the morning and just going and sharing this also completely with us, because it's a complex issue. And to some extent, it really doesn't sink in until you start seeing walls that look like, one of the Great Pyramids above the beach, and seeing the equipment imagery and so on, and just talking these things through, because this has been on OPRD's radar since the beginning of our existence as a department, and on ODOT's radar beforehand. And it is just, it's coming at us ready or not. And so the resources that are required are going to be astonishing, I hate to say, just the budgetary implications. I appreciate Commissioner Berger's recommendation. I like it. I know there was a kind of prototypical coastal commission back, anyway, it's an interesting history. Steve Shipsey can tell you more. But also it does, so I do feel like, yes, there's this need for increased integration with local governments, other agencies with shared jurisdiction, but I just think continuously, this is all well known by staff, but I mean, internal coordination around these issues, because we're dealing with this at every level. These questions that we're talking about today affect acquisition choices we make in the future along the coastline, disposition choices potentially as well, visitor services, infrastructure development, the choices we make at every level on the coast right now are going to be affected by these things happening in the next few decades. And so it's all hands on board in some ways, and every department, every division within OPRD talking to each other. It's a very good thing. We have an executive group, all are pretty tight on a first name basis talking about these things, because I just think that, what we're talking about today, in a way, you're talking about your program and its sort of universe of concerns and interests and mandates. But what you're talking about ripples through the entire department, everybody in the room. So anyway, I thank you for this, and I just hope we continue to have these discussions on into the future. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner. One thing I did want to point out, we were standing right here. That's that riprap below the the
Mhm.
pier wall.
The pier wall.
That's
So,
where
yeah.
you were standing this
We
morning.
were standing this morning right here.
We had to
So
move.
just imagine, as I said, I've got pictures of, I forgot I'd put this one in here and I did that for that purpose to show you that, it's easy to pass judgment. We're standing out on the beach. But when you're a landowner and this is hitting,
It's real.
low, it's real. And the ocean is extremely powerful. And that's the one thing we've got to make sure we're keeping in mind is that there's this balance, but it's really hard to have a dialogue with somebody and say, well, these waves are, hitting your property are less important than the public having the beach. It's an extremely difficult discussion.
Conversation. That's why you
And-
need a higher level.
So anyways, and that the seawall's back over here, obviously, but yeah, that stretch of coast can get some, and stands for any stretch of the coast can get some pretty big wave action. And I'm sure there's even been more heavier wave action on these, but gives you a good representative that it is interfacing with the ocean.
So I just want to thank staff because I think when we put this together, it was like 3 days worth of content and we were like, how can we do this in one day? So
Wow.
thank you all for being willing to get
Yeah.
up at like 7:30 in
Thank
the
you.
morning because it's a lot. And to your point, Commissioner Dewar, we didn't get to talk about, so Matt and JR are meeting with the county right now to talk about some other issues. But at the same time, we've been meeting with several other vendors, several other states and talking about what the climate adaptation strategy looks like for the entire
Yeah.
organization. And I think the biggest piece for us was with the Go Bonds Cape Lookout, we had 2 contractors tell us you can't build a campground there. And we're like, well, fine, we'll go get another contractor, right? Like we couldn't even accept the answer ourselves. And it was like, so we need to start talking about disposition and retreat strategies and start leading the way in these other sides of the organization. So it is beautiful that the executive team is so interconnected to be able to have these dialogues. And
That's right.
it's probably the most focus we've ever had. And I know Dennis is always like the ocean, the ocean, the ocean, the coast is everything, but it really is our biggest deal
Yeah.
politically. If you'd stop planting grass, we'd be fine, but it is,
We take care of it.
climate and budget are our biggest
Yep.
issues right now.
That's
And
right.
the ocean is, regardless what you believe, you can see it in action right here. You saw it this morning. So thanks for your diligence and willingness to be out there in the cold and not super windy, but
By the way, gentlemen, Denise put her phone down so I could hear you coming in, driving in. It was a really good discussion. I'm sorry I missed it. Show and tell this morning.
So I gotta say thanks to him, and this is great and it's helpful and for a guy from the dry side. But what bothers me when I back up and look at big picture stuff, this same kind of stuff's gonna happen on our side of the state, and we're not getting ahead of it. And I'm not sure it's our job, this agency's job, but it's also all of our job to make sure we recognize that. I drove from Ontario to Boise the other day, first time I have in, I don't know, 10 years. And some of the greatest farmland in the United States is nothing but houses today. Thank God for land use in Oregon. But we still, I said it earlier about drones in the scenic corridors. We can ignore that, but it's going to be a problem if we do. And so I don't know how we get there to all of this. And just any one of these issues will consume us. So how do we get it done?
The ocean will make sure we pay attention here.
Yeah.
It is changing dramatically.
100 years from now, what are you gonna do with all that riprap? Because those houses are
I'm
gonna be
have-
gone
I'm gonna
and
have-
all that stuff's down there.
Have beachfront.
Yeah, no, I bet in 100.
Yeah. Dennis is guaranteed me.
New jetties.
And in addition to the ocean, Commissioner, we are also looking at our climate adaptation strategies around fire, reservoirs, drought. I mean, the ocean's just pressing and it's right there and it's obvious, but we're looking at the entirety. It's real.
And there's larger efforts, like I've sit on a work group for the DLCD has on the natural hazard mitigation plan. There's a lot of the discussion we were having today and kind of that broader discussion. I guess I'll say there's at least some attempts to start trying to, how do we coalesce that? I mean, right now they're looking at how do we map and identify where these areas are and these problem areas are, but then I think it also rolls up into how as a state do we deal with some of this, which, then dovetails into how our agencies operate and other agencies operate. And so hopefully from different areas, by just being a voice and being engaged in those at least we can get our voice out there, and hopefully at some point in time that coalesces into.
The 9-0 will fix a lot of this, so, when the big one hits.
When you become oceanfront.
When we all go to the east side.
I get oceanfront.
Well, thank you guys.
Yeah,
Very
thank
much
you.
appreciate this. Really,
Thank
really
you.
informative and helpful.
So dinner is at Georgie.